Oliver Franzke. Welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel Albu.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I feel quite honored that, you invited me to come and talk to you today.
On this channel, I'm used to interviewing the people who made the games I played as a kid. But in your case, since we're about the same age, or at least from the same generation, you didn't just play these games as a kid, you also got the privilege of working on their remasters. And that's exactly why I wanted to interview you today.
I'm shocked. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of crazy, and I never really expect. When I first moved to America to join LucasArts, I never expected that anything like this would happen. I did jokingly mention that to my friends in London that, you know what, I'm going to join LucasArts, and my one goal for doing that will be to make the company make adventure games again. And I never really thought that would happen. That was mostly a joke. But then, it kind of did happen. So that's awesome and humbling.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you get into programming?
Oh, that started actually really early. I mean, I have to kind of do a little tangent. I grew up originally in East Germany, so behind the Iron Curtain. And when the wall came down, I was about 8 years old. And at this point, 8 years, I probably had seen some of the East German computers, but very rarely, because it was something that you really, as an ordinary person, didn't really get access to. But I was aware that something like that existed. But then when the wall came down, a lot of the families, or people who had some of these old, like, East German computers, went ahead and bought like a C64 or an actual real PC, and then they didn't need their old East German computer anymore. And then so pretty much right away after the wall fell down, my parents kind of were talking to friends of ours that had one of those old East German computers, and they pretty much agreed that we would buy the machine. So that kind of personal computer, East German personal computer, ended up in my room. And pretty much as long as I can remember having this, I programmed on that. Like, if you imagine a C64 interface, with bootstrap shows you the 64 kilobytes of RAM and like a basic interpreter and whatnot and assembly, it's exactly the same. That's because East Germany pretty much just copied the hardware, from what I can tell. So I realized very quickly that you could program with that. In fact, the actual computer came with like a manual of programming in BASIC, and I was hooked. I realized right away that you can make your own games with that. And this kind of coincided with this magical moments of, some of my friends actually having C64s or Amigas, and then being exposed to these really early games, like in the late 80s. Some of, text-based adventures, Hugo's House of Horrors and stuff like that, and other games. And then, realizing, okay, as a kid, you have time, you can go and program and see how close you can get to that. So like pretty much right from the beginning, since I was 8 years old, I've been programming games. Now, of course, I upped my tech game over the years, but that's how I got into programming.
And what was the name of your computer?
Well, it was East Germany, so they abbreviated. It's Germany, so they don't give fancy names. It was just called a client computer 84.3, I believe. So KC 84.3 or 85.3. See, it's been so long, I don't actually remember which number it is. But yeah, so KC, let's say 84.3.
So that's the thing. That's the thing. I noticed some inconsistency in your recollection of which model you had at the time. Because on your website, it says that you had the 85.3.
Yeah.
But in the Double Fine documentary, you originally said that it was 85.3. But for some reason, it was overdubbed with you saying that it was 85.4.
There you go. Then it must be that. Probably what happened. So Two Player Productions, who were doing the documentary on the Broken Age, they asked me if I wanted to give them extra assets that they could kind of splice into the video. So I had like a picture of, my old computer in there that I, asked my parents to take, and I read the name of the computer was on the front of it, and so that's probably why why we did the overdubbing. I totally forgot about that we overdubbed it. Yeah, you're right, that's true. Yeah. So whatever I said back then, that's like 10 years ago now, right? Or 12 or something like that.
So here it is. I want to show you the clip.
Friend of mine who,
oh my gosh, look how young I was.
Like,
and tired.
Had a really good position in the company.
Listen,
had a computer called the KC854.
You see, you're saying something else, but they overdubbed it with the 85.4.
Amazing. I'm actually really glad that 2Player Production accommodated my crazy request, because I could have just left it and just said it like, whatever, it's fine. Nobody, like apart from the 2 other programmers I know from that time, nobody will be able to fact check this information. But I'm glad they let me be crazy and actually be accurate there. So there you go. I should really write it down somewhere.
And I also noticed that they overdubbed it. So
there you go.
And do you remember any specific differences or quirks of the 85.4 compared to the original C64?
Oh, you mean in terms of specific games?
In terms of
any
functionality.
Okay.
I mean, it was supposed to be a clone of the C64.
It was pretty similar from what I remember. I mean, it had maybe there was a difference in the assembly interface, so you could program kind of on a more low level using kind of some kind of assembly language. So if you want to do anything fancy, and some of the fancier games that existed for this computer were definitely implemented in assembly. But that was kind of too over my head at this point. But as far as the basic goes, that pretty much worked. I remember having magazines that came with like game source code in BASIC in it, and for the C64, and you could pretty much verbatim just copy and paste it and it would work. Maybe there were a few things you need to fix, but I don't remember any specific things. Obviously, some internet person will come like, oh, hold on, there's a whole bunch of differences. I mean, for one, you could actually extend the RAM. It had like 2 slots in the front, so if you didn't, if your 64 kilobytes weren't enough, you could actually like put in an additional RAM. That was nice. I don't think that was quite as easy for the C64. But yeah, other than that, I mean, the library of games was completely different, right? Because none of the Western games ever made it onto this platform. It was all East German programmers who had implemented and sometimes re-implemented game ideas also from the West. I remember there's this game, kind of a side-scrolling game where you're in a pyramid and pyramids, and you're kind of exploring, and you have to, jump past bats and traps and whatnot. And at some point, I found this essentially the same game on some other platform, like Amiga or something like that. I was like, hold on, wait, I know this game. So, some East German programmer had seen it somewhere and said, like, well, I can do the same thing. Man, was great.
And at the time, you also had a Unist monitor. And, when I played these games back in the day, whether it was Maniac Mansion or Zack McCracken or even Loom, I played them on my monochrome monitor, which was, I don't remember the brand, but I had a Hercules graphics card.
Oh, nice.
And so what was that experience like? What was it like playing those early Lucasfilm games, adventure games on Unist?
Well, I never played it. I never played the adventure games on my computer. And friends who had like a C64, they often had it connected to more like a proper television set, so it was like a color TV. So I don't think I ever played the early, like Zack McCracken. I only ever remember playing that in color and not in monochrome.
Wow. In the late 80s in color?
Yeah. Beautiful EGA or whatever, 5 colors or whatever it was, and it was amazing. But yeah, it was at friends' houses. We didn't have that until we got a PC, but that was much later. That was years later. Yeah.
Wait, so you couldn't run these games on the KC854?
No, and I mean, maybe if you would have been a really good programmer, there would have been a way to take like a C64 game. I don't know. That would be really interesting, actually.
I mean, if it's a perfect clone of the C64, then it should run as is.
Yeah, so I'm not enough of an expert for the hardware to say it's a perfect clone. It's just like visually, it looked exactly the same. It's possible that East Germany just said like, you know what, we're taking all the ideas and we're just doing what we can with what we have. So I don't know how far down the similarities go, or well, they end at some point. That would be interesting. But yeah, I could never play any of the original like early late 80s games and LucasArts or other adventures on this machine. I had to go to other people's houses for that until I had my own like PC.
So both Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken, you played on color
Yeah,
screens?
I went to like a friend. That's right. Yeah, a friend had like actually I had multiple friends who had like C64, and some people needed for work. They had like at home like some of these really early IBM PCs. So that was also a whole different experience. Yeah, so I had to go to other people's houses. Yeah.
And since BASIC was the first programming language you learned, do you remember the first thing you ever successfully coded in it? Whether it was copied verbatim from a magazine or if you came up with it yourself?
I don't know what the first thing is that I came up with myself, but I know that the first thing I probably ever programmed is the typical hello world that was in that book that came with the computer. You know, just a print statement, a single line like print hello or something like that in German. They probably didn't say hello world in English, but I do have very vivid memories of writing kind of like a mixed like graphical and text adventure. So the way you interacted with the game was via text, like text output and input. But I would in code, I would draw lines to kind of try to give an impression of what the environment would look like. So I remember, writing code to draw lines to have like a rectangle and a smaller rectangle in the middle, and then like diagonal lines to make it appear like you're in some kind of room. And then I think I added a door and a window and whatnot, and then you could say like open door, and it would change the state. I don't think I got very far because the problem with BASIC was that you needed to ahead of time lay out your line numbers. So you would say on line 10, I want to say print, and line 20, I want to draw a line. But then if you made any changes, afterwards, if you realized, I need to actually add some more stuff in between. If you had no more line numbers available that you previously didn't use, then you would need to start overwriting your code. And that would mean that the code that you overwrote, you have to then append somewhere, but then you would overwrite everything after that. So it was incredibly cumbersome. Maybe there was some kind of editor that made this easier, but I wasn't aware of that. So I just like literally, the way the BASIC interface worked, you type the line number and what should happen, and the next line number what should happen, and then you said run, and I would execute that stuff. And if you wanted to add more code, you would add more line numbers. And then you could actually save that out afterwards. And so this was East Germany, and actually even some other computers back at the time had the same thing. It was stored to cassette as like an audio file essentially. So you had to literally put like an audio cassette, press record, and then said, okay, save, and it would start spinning the cassette, and you could hear like modem sounds, essentially how it would write down the digital program as analog information. And if you wanted to load that the other way around, you would kind of say, okay, load this thing, and then you would start the cassette deck, and then play back the sounds. And of course, this means if you want to have multiple programs on a cassette, you need to write down at what time stamped the program started and ended, so that let's say I want to play this game that I was talking about earlier, but with the pyramids, I had like a little sheet that said, okay, well, this game starts at like 4 minutes and 23 seconds. So I would fast forward the cassette to that time, and then say, okay, load, and then play, and I would load that program, and then you could run it.
Good times.
Yeah.
Now, let's take a look at a photo from that time. Now, is that you playing, or is that you programming?
Oh, this posture looks more like programming. So you can see the keyboard had these arrow keys on the right side. So my right hand is on these arrow keys. And actually, I still have this computer and the keyboard. The arrow keys and the space key have been pretty used up, and the space key is even broken, like because space often was used to shoot or jump or something. So if you get really into it, you would slam the space key, and at some point it broke, and it still works. You just have to use one half and not the not the other. But this posture looks more like me playing than programming for sure.
Now, you talked about the text adventure games that you created in BASIC, and do you remember any puzzles or game mechanics you implemented in these games?
It was all pretty basic. I never really completed any games in BASIC, so I think, the early games I don't really remember. It was pretty much just like navigating, traversing the world, to get to some place, and maybe you had to find a key or something, looking under some objects to find a key so you can unlock the door. But I don't think I ever get farther than that. Later games that I implemented, but that was on the PC, I got a bit more fancy. But I also realized at some point that really game design is not really so much my level of interest. I always had way more fun actually implementing than designing.
Okay. And back then you also had a video camera. Do you still have any of the footage you filmed back then? Hopefully you filmed some gameplay.
Yeah, that camera, I don't actually know where that came from. So this on the left is my dad. And we were pretending to do. So the other thing is this thing I'm holding in my hand that looks like a microphone is actually not a real microphone. Maybe you can tell. It's just like some kind of cardboard roll with like a surprise egg thing glued to it. So my dad used this camera, I'm pretty sure, for a lot of like the home videos, and a couple of years ago he digitized some of them. I don't think there's ever been anywhere I'm doing something with the computer. Maybe one where I'm like opening at Christmas, opening the box with the PC in it or something. But I don't know how much of that is really still left. The fact that he let me hold it is already crazy. Was expensive back then.
Because it would be interesting to see some of the gameplay of the games that you worked on.
See, I was not good. In a way, I'm an expert game developer at this point because I was not good at archiving what I did. I can almost guarantee that there's a cassette on my parents' attic that has my programs on it, or at least had it on it, because cassettes demagnetize over the time. So at this point, there's just going to be static on there. I should have done a better job and after a couple of years, got those out and digitize them into MP3s like other people done. There's actually a website, and I forget the name, where you can get programs and games for this KC computer as MP3 files, and then somebody else wrote like an emulator of this machine, and so you can load these MP3 files as if it's been loaded for a cassette deck and play them, which was pretty awesome. But yeah, I didn't. Unfortunately, I didn't keep any of that, which is a real shame. I still have my Turbo Pascal, so I did a better job with my PC afterwards. But this early computer, I did not do a good job with archiving.
Okay, so speaking of your PC, in 1995, you put your Unist monitor away. Here it is over there, right on the side. Got yourself a Super VGA monitor, and you grew a rat tail. Look at that. Look at your rat tail.
Yeah. I want to point out something else. Next to the monitor on the left, there's a pilot's helmet, and that is like an original East German fighter pilot helmet that somehow my uncle got that, and then he gave it to me. I don't know ever why, but I love that helmet, pretending to playing. I have memories of playing Wing Commander and putting that helmet on just to make it more immersive. But yes, yeah. So that's my first PC, 386 with a turbo button, amazing. And the other thing I want to point out, if you look at the game on there,
it's Mortal Kombat 3.
It's Mortal Kombat 3, which you were not allowed at this age that I am at there to buy in Germany. So I remember with my parents driving to Berlin and asking my parents to go into the store to actually pick up the game that I had ordered.
It's not a pirated copy. You have the manual over here.
It's the real thing. Yeah. I should say that Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 I also did not legitimately own. And some other games because they were just not sold in Germany. Some games were just due to the level of violence in there, or other things.
Like Wolfenstein.
Wolfenstein, because of the imagery in there, you could just not get in Germany at all. Yeah, I remember the first time I saw Wolfenstein, which blew my mind, was when we were on vacation in Denmark. Um, and just the fact that you had this like real-time 3D was just wow, how, because up at this point I've seen games where you had these dungeon crawlers, right? So you had a 3D view, but then you kind of went in steps. But with Wolfenstein, everything was so smooth, and it was crazy. It was crazy.
So, given the fact that you're playing Mortal Kombat 3 over here, who's your favorite Mortal Kombat 3 character?
Through all the Mortal Kombat, Sub-Zero has been my favorite.
Sub-Zero.
Yeah, Sub-Zero. I actually
That's the correct answer.
Yeah. You can't see, but I have from once Mortal Kombat was finally, there were new games coming out in the 2010s or so. Mm-hmm. I have like the special edition thing up there where Scorpion is like harpooning Sub-Zero. So it's like a book holder, has like two sides. You can put books in between. And on one side you've got Scorpion with the harpoon thing, and it's going through on the other side. And anyway, I'm still offended because I prefer Sub-Zero over Scorpion, but there you go.
Wait, and in 1995 was Mortal Kombat released in Germany? Back then?
Yeah, I think back then, I think Germany had become like a pretty big market for games. Oh, you mean the movie or the game?
I mean the movie.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I don't know exactly when I watched that, but I definitely watched that. I love that. First Mortal Kombat movie was great with Christopher Lambert. That was amazing. I should actually rewatch that.
Yeah, it's the only good video game based movie since then.
Yeah. I mean, nostalgia is also a powerful force. I bet if I were to watch Mortal Kombat now, the movie, I would probably think that it's, has some rough edges that back then I was like, this is amazing.
No, the soundtrack is still badass. And
that was so good. I had the soundtrack as a CD. I remember I listened to that all the time. That was so good. Yeah.
Now, the following year, in 1996, you created a first-person adventure game called Human Shock using Turbo Pascal, an assembly language.
Right, it was mixed. The big parts of the game were just Turbo Pascal, but any of the graphical stuff you had to do assembly to write to the frame buffer and the sprites splitting and stuff like that. I never really got to sound, so I would have needed some assembly for that as well. But yeah, I love Turbo Pascal. So Turbo Pascal was like my next step after Basic. And I loved it. It had like Ball and Pascal as editor. Which was amazing. It just like was such a change to see that you can actually work productively as a programmer rather than having to type line numbers. And I did a lot of games with Turbo Pascal. Human Shock is the one I probably got the furthest. I didn't just program it; I also created the graphics. And there was a German 3D tool. And I forgot the name. I'm blanking on the name. I'm actually friends with one of the original programmers, but I'm blanking on the name now. That is very embarrassing. Anyway, I used that program to create all the graphics for that. Like, in 3D, it was very Myst-like. So I created model like 3D environments, put textures on it, and then the gameplay required state changes, so you had to create multiple sprites of various states in the world. So I created those, and then I wrote code to implement. Well, if the state is active, if you picked up the ladder, then you remove the ladder sprite from the wall where it was previously. And yeah, I was pretty proud of that. I had even an intro animation that I rendered myself. Had like a little animation of like a light, like traveling to the center and exploding, like a triangle exploding some text and whatnot. Was great. Yeah, that was good.
How long did it take you to render that cutscene?
Probably several days. The 386 wasn't that fast, and I always liked effects. I liked, volumetric effects and some reflections if I could get it. But because of that, it would take really long. And you start working at really small resolutions to be able to see anything, and then you would render it. And then, of course, you have to convert it. Like, it's just the image sequence. You have to compress it into 256 colors, which is the problem of FMVs at this time. So you lost some fidelity there. But yeah, that was some good time. I wrote other games in Topaz Color at the time. I remember writing some like Command and Conquer like game. That was something else that was hugely influenced me as a game, like real-time strategy. Dune 2. When I first played Dune 2, I was just pretty much just stuck in my room. I couldn't leave. It just was such a game, especially with I think it was one of the first games. I don't know, but it had like the voice out. So like the fact that all the units would say like affirmative and going here and doing that, it was just really cool, made you really feel like a battlefield commander. But I had a real fondness for this type of game. I remember doing that. Diablo. I remember trying to write like some kind of scrolly game with where was kind of like Diablo, but I also like Warhammer 40k. So like it had more like a Space Marine kind of character that would walk around. Anyway, none of these really made it very far. I think, like I said, for me, I think I realized maybe afterwards more than at the time that the joy of programming is really what drives me rather than designing the game and finishing it. It's just solving the problems and making it work. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about your first official game credit. In 2002, you're credited for programming and scripting on Michael Schumacher Racing World kart, 2002. So I understand that you wrote a 3D engine in C++, and that helped you get an internship?
So there's several things that happened that kind of are influential here. I had done some research in between, like what actually the real game programmers do, and I, learned pretty quickly that C and C++ is the way to go. And then towards the end of my childhood was the rise of the graphics accelerators. So you had like the Voodoo 3D, and the first NVIDIA graphics card came out. And with that, DirectX came out as an API to program these graphics cards. So I got a book on programming DirectX. And so I worked my way through that. I switched to C++ programming. Probably switched to Visual Studio and programmed some simple 3D stuff. Mostly at this point was actually, well, what I remember writing, which I should really dig out, is like another thing that influenced me a lot as a child was Star Trek. So I love this idea of the holodeck, this environment where you could just create any place and you can be in there. So I wanted to make a game where you like start out in the holodeck and then you could, go into different worlds. And I didn't get very far, but I did get as far as having the holodeck there and in 3D, and you had like some kind of gun attached to your character, so you could rotate around and walk around in the holodeck environment and shoot like little yellow balls. So that was one thing. That's true. I did write that. That did help me to get the job. But the other thing I also did in between is I had a huge fondness for 3D graphics. And partially this is because this was the time, the 90s, when you had movies with visual effects coming out, like Star Trek TNG was a good example. But also The Last Starfighter just completely changed my life, I think, because when I saw that, I was like, how in the world did they do that? And I had a book series about like computers and what they can do, and one of them was about like, oh, you can use computers to create like realistic photorealistic 3D graphics, and what you do is you do something that's called a ray tracer. And so I was like, well, okay, I got to find out more about that. And then at the same time, I also and I'm ashamed to admit it, as I upgraded from the German 3D modeling software that I had actually bought a copy of, to 3ds Max, so 3D Studio Max. And I was spending a lot of time in 3D Studio Max creating models. Actually, in two-player production, the side quest, I think there's some pictures that are in there of some of the models I created for in 3ds Max. So I had a lot of fun creating 3D environments and modeling things, but I also at the same time learned programming, and I love programming. And then naturally what you do is you see a program like 3D Studio Max, and you want to re-implement that. So I have vivid memories of sitting down in Visual Studio and like the Win32 API, essentially implementing a 3D editor that let you place down objects. So it had like these 4 views, less like in 3D Max, like top, side, front, and a perspective, and had like a side panel where you could have objects that would show their properties, and you could change things like the light, color, and whatnot. And then if you wanted to render it, I had written, started to write like my very first like image synthesis code. So it would try to figure out how to show the 3D world in some kind of shaded way. But at this point, I didn't have the math. And what's kind of funny is because this was in school, final years of high school, where you actually learn linear algebra. But the way linear algebra was presented to us is like, there's some vectors and some matrices, but really they're just equations, and they have no. It was never clear to me that they have some kind of geometric representation, so you could use linear algebra to do stuff with and compute things. I really just never clicked until much later. So I promise I'm going to get to the Michael Schumacher racing card.
Don't worry, take your time.
The last step now is I finished high school, and I had done some research into what I should study to make it possible for me to work in games. So since pretty much, like I said earlier, pretty much since I had a computer, I realized that I enjoy programming. And then through the PC years, I knew that my career path is making games or 3D modeling. And I did research like, okay, what can I study in Germany that will make it easier for me to follow that goal? And this was like the late 90s, early 2000s. And there was a new course that had just appeared that was called Media Computer Science, because that was like the rise of the internet and whatnot. So they were trying to appeal to the people who wanted to study computer science, but also do something with media. And I had found a university in Dresden, like in the Middle East, in the middle part of Germany to the east, that I wanted to go to. And I applied, but essentially the first course was full. But it wasn't really a big deal because at this point in Germany, when you're 18 as a guy, you had to do like compulsory military service. I mean, you could skip out of it and do like a social year. So you could do, the old person's home and help out there. But the difference was that if you go to the army, you had to do 10 months. And if you do the social year, you had to do like 13 months or 12 months or something like that. So purely from like the quantitative difference, I said, okay, well, I want to spend as little time as possible on any of this. I'm just going to go to the army. So I started my military service, and I was like in the northern part of Germany, and I was actually part of a tank battalion. And through like a weird coincidence, well, I don't know, maybe not that weird. During the finishing of my basic training in the military service, I broke my foot because we're doing this really long marches through the woods and whatnot. And I was an inside kid who programmed. I don't go on long walks in the woods, and I had to carry all this heavy gear. So anyway, I broke my foot, and because of that, I had a cast on my leg, and I couldn't do the next step, which would be actually learning how to operate a tank, which is good. And I was sent home, but it meant I missed all the specialized training for the tank. And when I came back to finish my time at the military, they said, well, you can't do tanks, but we do need someone in the office. I heard you can do something with computers. I was like, yep, sure. So they put me in the office and essentially just do file stuff like writing documents and some Excel spreadsheets and whatnot. But there really wasn't that much to do. And one day I was walking around at the town that I was stationed, and I walked into a bookstore, and I found what many people at this time would call like the Bible of computer graphics, which is Computer Graphics Principle and Practice in C, 3rd edition. And I saw it, and I was like, yes, okay, I'm going to buy this book. And I bought that book and I pretty much read it cover to cover, and it like blew my mind because it explained how you implement 3D graphics from the very basic up until what was considered back then photorealism. So given with that knowledge and that I had a lot of time, I then also started implementing some of that stuff and starting writing software to essentially create ray traced images. And then my military service ended, and I was like, okay, let's go back to my actual quest of getting a job in the games industry. And I took my work that I had so far, which was like screenshots from my games and some of these 3D renders that I had modeled myself, these objects, and I printed them out. I printed them out on paper, and I wrote like a cover letter saying, "Hey, I would love to be an intern at your company." And I pretty much sent it to every German games company that existed at this time. And I pretty much didn't hear from anyone apart from Blue Byte, which is the company behind Settlers and Battle Isle. So they actually, the lead artist there, came back and wrote back, "Oh, great to see applications. Unfortunately, we don't have any place, but here's some advice of how you can improve your 3D modeling." So it was nice, but
And what advice did he give you?
Oh man, that is good. I think he was just telling me to pretty much like clean up my models more and add more detail and stuff like that. It's been a long time. I mean, if you look at the graphics for Settlers 2, it had like this really beautiful detailed art. So that's where they are coming from. But I was lucky. So I was already kind of giving up, but then eventually I got a letter back from a small German indie company called Terra Tools, located kind of on the outskirts of Berlin, in the city called Potsdam, which is the capital of Prussia, or was the capital of Prussia, which is where I'm living now. But yeah, back then they said, "Okay, cool, yeah, you can come for an interview." And pretty much, I think like a day or two after I had finished my military service, I drove up to Potsdam to interview for this company, and it was amazing. It was really like all my dreams coming true because I was actually people making games. I was actually in a place where people professionally made games, and so I presented mostly my 3D work because what I wanted to do most at this point was like modeling, like environment modeling, character modeling, stuff like that. And they said, "Yeah, you can have an interview. So you can have an internship here." And so when can you start? And I said, "Well, pretty much right away," which is what I had done. And so very excitedly, very soon after that, I drove for my first day of actually working in a games company. And at Terra Tools, back then, they were working at the Michael Schumacher Racing World Card and other stuff. And the thing is, they didn't really have actually much need for somebody to doing 3D graphics. But what they really needed help with was programming. And man, I'm sorry. I had told them in the interview that I also do C++ programming, and I'd done some, DirectX and whatnot. I had the 3D engine and whatnot. And they said, "Hey, maybe you can help us out with the programming." And pretty much since that day, I've been a programmer and not an artist. And then I worked on various projects, including Michael Schumacher Racing World Cup, where I did a lot of the work for the bots so that they follow splines and whatnot. Particles. I think I did a lot of work in particles.
And so the following year, you wrote a couple of papers about the accurate graphical representation of plant leaves. So my question is, what's your obsession with plant leaves, and how does the proposed method you presented differ from previous leaf translucency rendering techniques?
Right. Well, yeah. So I'm going to be telling stories, but the reason I got there is I actually so this was university work I've done. Like I said, this is research, graphics research, and when I started university, I was still initially working for TerraTools, working pretty much remotely, which is crazy at this time, but I learned a pretty early lesson in video games. That is that it's a hit-driven industry. So if you don't make your sales number, the company might just disappear. And this is in fact what happened in 2002. TerraTools unfortunately just couldn't maintain its financial stability, and they had to, close. Which was a bummer because I loved working there. But I took all of my work that I mentioned earlier, like these ray tracers, which I kept writing newer versions of with more and more features and higher fidelity. And one day I walked into my professor's office for computer graphics, Oliver Deussen, and said, "Here, hello, I wrote this ray tracer. Can I do like a graphics research project with you?" And Oliver Deussen's specialty was anything plant related with computer graphics. So he's done a lot of work plant modeling. So like, how do you represent plants? There's like generative algorithms you can write to create plants and whatnot. He's done a lot of work with that. And he said, "Oh, I like your ray tracer. You know what? I've been thinking about the fact that I actually want to do a better job of like visually just photorealistic rendering of leaves. There hadn't really been much work on that up until this point. So we went and we took a couple of plants that we had modeled with his other tools that he had a company for, and we took leaves of that type of plant in the real world, and we were essentially trying to create various these days you would call like texture maps from the front, from the back side, but also like a translucency map, so to see how much light comes through and what that looks like. And then I went ahead, taking these maps, essentially implemented what you would these days call like BSSDF representation. So like a volumetric representation of the inside of the plant. So I would like step through the tissue, epidermis and whatnot of the plant to kind of figure out how much light bounces back to the camera. So, and I remember making these turntables of a light going around the plant. And, first you have these like smooth representation where the light is shining on the plant from this side where you're at. So you get like, shining reflection. Then it comes from the other side and you get this really bright green, like almost glow of what it looks like when you're, when the sun shines like through a tree canopy or something like that. And it represented this like really nicely. There really hadn't been any much work on that. And then my professor was really awesome because he said, "Well, this looks really cool. And even though you're like an undergrad student and you're not even like done with your stuff, let's just write this up into a paper and propose and like hand it into the biggest computer graphics conference in the world." And I said, "Okay." And I produced most of the images and he did most of the writing, which was just like a 1-page kind of a short paper. But presumably not because of my work, but because my professor was somewhat known in the computer graphics world, this paper got accepted. And then, he was like, "Well, okay, we need to present this paper now at SIGGRAPH, which in this year, in 2003, was in San Diego. But I'm not, my professor said, I am not going to present this paper. You're going to present this paper." I was like, "What?" So we flew out to San Diego, which was my first time in the US and the first time where I had to like speak English, continuously. And the first time I had to present in front of a room of like, hundreds of people, in my non-native language. And that was absolutely terrifying, but also somewhat like riveting. And I remember people asking questions afterwards, and my brain had already switched off because I was just so glad that I had like given my speech that I had rehearsed, and I was trying to answer and whatnot. But so then I kept doing research, kind of mostly in plant modeling up until the end of my master thesis with Oliver Deussen. So that's how we got to these papers about plant running. That was because of the expertise that my professor had rather than my own expertise in plants. I really don't have a green thumb. Plants usually don't survive if I'm responsible for them.
Maybe plants look so good in games nowadays because of your paper.
You know what the thing is? I remember playing Oblivion, I think, Elder Scrolls, and they had like amazing foliage. I mean, just that was the first time where you had a RPG where you could walk into like a forest, and it had actually like thick coverage of grass and trees with lots of leaves. And at a later conference, the second time I went to Ziggurat to present my work there, which was my master part of my master's thesis, I gave a presentation at the same session that the programmer from Bethesda who implemented some of this like foliage stuff. So he put us in the same track, and it was really awesome talking to him, and just a different world. And in a way, it kind of actually opened my eyes, because I had dabbled in the graphics research, but I had also kind of seen the side of that I didn't really like, and that is, you do a lot of projects that don't necessarily have an immediate real life like impact, because you have to you have to write grants, you have to get money somewhere, and so you're going to work on research stuff that's flashy that people want at the time, and that's not necessarily what you're interested in. And also the fact that as a PhD student you would need to like teach and also do research, but then you have to do paper reviews and all that stuff, all the aspects I really personally didn't enjoy about that life. I kind of was thinking about it, and then talking to the other guy who was working for Bethesda, it's like, you know what? Yeah, you're right. I should probably go and and work go back to the industry. And then, so even though my professor really wanted me to join him as a PhD student, I decided to not go down this route and just do something different.
So we move on to 2004. In 2004, you were credited for testing on Ballens.
I did more than. I'm still upset about that. I did more than testing. I wrote a lot of code for that game.
That was my question, because given the fact that you're such a talented developer, I wanted to know if your role was focused on basic testing, or did you get to use your programming expertise to, track down hard to find bugs in the code? So I'm happy to hear that you did code in this project. Why didn't they credit you?
Balance was a difficult project. So Balance was a game we were working at TerraTools. That was the first game at a games company I worked for. And when the company shut down and folded, it was mostly done, but they just couldn't find. I may be getting some of the details wrong here, but from what I remember, that they couldn't find a publisher to publish it. So it actually didn't really release right away, because I think we had it done earlier than 2004. So then eventually, through the former CEO of that company kept working on it, and eventually found someone to publish it. And because of that, and I was somewhat detached from the company at this point, I didn't really get the proper credit for this game. And that's fine. That's fine. I know what I did in that game. I actually saw the other day that it's been released on Steam now, like just a couple of years ago, which is crazy. Some other publisher now, I guess the publisher in between had folded, and now it's a whole different publisher, but you can download on Steam and play it. And
Atari is the publisher.
Oh, now it's Atari. Crazy. They must have bought maybe the other publisher that did it in between.
So that's why it's on Steam.
That's really cool. Yeah. I enjoyed working on this game. It's kind of like a puzzle game where you roll around with a ball and stuff changes. You have to balance. As the name says, you have to balance. It was a fun project to work on.
And you can write in your resume that you worked for Atari.
True.
So, at what point did you tell yourself that it's time to apply for a position at LucasArts?
Well, at what time? That was much later. So at the end of my degree, this was the time. Really, now that I presented like that, it really sounds like I'm just being swept away with whatever fad happened to be popular at the time. But like the early 2000s was the years when Pixar finally hit their stride, and they released like Incredibles and Finding Nemo and all these amazing movies. And I saw these movies in the cinema. Pardon me. And I really wanted to do that. I was like, oh man, this looks so cool. It meshes with my expertise of 3D graphics so well. So what I actually was trying to do is get an internship at Pixar. And I still, while being at college, I applied for the college student internship program from Germany, but I never heard back. But I kind of kept going with that dream. I was like, this is so much fun. I want to write like image synthesis software. So at the end of my studies, 2005, I was looking around what I can do in that field. And in Germany, there wasn't really much happening at this point in like 3D, like companies that create 3D graphics. So I cast my web wider. I actually wrote emails to the BBC in Bristol that got back to me and said, "Oh, we would love for you to come and be an intern, but we just don't have a position right now. But maybe you apply again next year." Because they were doing some, like, I guess the BBC had its own internal like animation studio, and I was mostly applying as what's called like in the industry back then called a technical director, which is this kind of somebody who works with code, but still does like stuff that goes into the movie. So, for example, you would write code that represents what the objects look like, and maybe sometimes simulation for fire and other stuff. So this kind of technical role on the movie production, not so much doing art. Like I'm not an artist, I'm not an animator. I know that. But I wanted to do this technical aspect. And one thing that I found as I was searching around in my final months in college is this really tiny little animation studio in Glasgow in the UK. It was called Glasgow Animation. I had never heard about it. But since I was like, well, I'm just going to write emails to everyone that I find, I wrote an email to them, and I got an email back and saying, yeah, sure, you can come and interview here. I can't guarantee that we'll give you a job, but you can come. So I finished my degree. I like pretty much like a week or two after I had my master's in my hand, I was on the way to the airport to fly to Glasgow to interview there. And this was crazy because up until this point, I really had never lived abroad. A lot of my friends in college did like a year abroad or something like that, but I kind of missed that train. I was so focused of like, no, I want to get my university degree done so I can do the next thing, that I never did any of that. So I was terrified about just, what I'm going to do. I'm just going to get in the airplane and fly to a different city and live there. That's just completely crazy. But on the other hand, I was like, no, I want to follow my dream. And, if I don't do this now, I'm probably never going to do that. So I flew to Glasgow, and Glasgow Animation was actually not in Glasgow, the city, but it was this tiny village where you had to take a bus for 20 minutes, Kilsyth, just outside, I think north of Glasgow or something like that. Anyway, so it's in this tiny village. From the bus stop, you have to walk down this like farmer's road for like maybe like 5 minutes to get to like a little building. And in there, they were making an animation movie where they somehow had gotten the voice of Sean Connery to be one of the characters. So I walked in there and I showed them the stuff I've done, writing the ray traces and some of the graphics stuff that I modeled and whatnot. And they were like, "Yeah, you should come. That's great. And we're gonna pay you just like the smallest amount of money possible, just so that you can barely live." But I took the job. So I found like a shared apartment somewhere in Glasgow, living with roommates, eating pretty much just ramen noodles, and going to work every day. And it was great. I learned a lot, but the company was also very unprofessional. Like it was a very small company that somehow seemed to be scraping by the UK tax benefits or something like that. I don't know how they survived. But after about like 6 months, I was like, okay, this movie will never make it. I think it eventually made it. but many years later. And I said, this is not good. I've got to go and do something else. And so one of the friends at this Glasgow animation company, I got introduced to a recruiter for games. And this was like the only time in my whole career I ever used a recruiter. But it was a perfect time for me because the recruiter knew all the companies in the UK, and he knew the kind of programmers that were needed, and he pretty much connected me right away with Sony in London. So I took the night bus. I took the night bus from Glasgow to London, where you literally like get into the bus in the evening, and then you drives all through the night, and you try to sleep while the bus is going, and then arrive like at 7 o'clock in the morning somewhere near Hyde Park. So I got out of the bus like probably pretty rough looking, I don't know, and I walked to Oxford Circus where this London studio was, and I interviewed there, and that was a whole different world. And I was pretty excited about the stuff that they were doing. Like the London studio had actually had a lot of success recently at this point, making games like The Getaway. So like big console 3D games, shooty driving games. And I was like, yes, this is great. And they showed me another game they were doing kind of in a similar vein that was set in the US. And it had like a cool art style. So I interviewed with that team, and mostly as kind of a graphics programmer. And I also interviewed with the iToy team, which is the camera that the PlayStation 3 had. So they wanted to make games like SingStar and iToy, some other stuff. That interviewed with both teams. And it ended up that both teams actually wanted to hire me. But since I think there was a higher need on the iToy team rather than the other one, I ended up on the iToy team. And then, yeah, so like I pretty much wrapped up my stuff there and moved to London. That was the end of 2005, I believe. So yeah, didn't stay very long in Glasgow, which is a shame because it's a nice city. But now at least I'm back to games, and I work in a pretty big company, and that was pretty awesome.
So just so you know, the movie you were working on, Billy the Vet, was eventually released in 2006. And it's got the amazing score of 2.8 on IMDb. 2.8 out of 10.
Yeah. It's not, it wasn't great. It's unfortunate because the company itself, well, it is part of the problem. The company itself was mostly staffed with interns. So you had all these young people from all over Europe that came with exactly the same reason that I came. They wanted to find a way into the movie industry somehow, animation industry. So you had all these people that really didn't know anything how to do stuff, and that's great. I mean, you can hire interns, and that's good to get that energy, but you need some kind of senior people in the company to guide that energy, right? And they just didn't have that structure, and it's so it had problems. But on the other hand, because I was one of the few people who was not an artist but a technical person, I got a lot of freedom to do what I thought was right. So I was managing the render farm that they had. They had like a room full of Linux servers where they had Maya on it, but they had no way to really send the rendering to all of these different computers. So I pretty much set up that whole system or whatnot so that we can render on all of these different Linux computers. So I learned a lot, and it was fun. The time in Glasgow. Glasgow is a really cool city. Was fun, but yeah, my time still had come, and there was time to do something else.
And at Sony, you worked on the particle editor. Did you get to create any tools for debugging that particle editor? Did you get to test it on various platforms? What did you do exactly to optimize the particle editor itself?
Well, to provide a little bit of historic context, when I joined Sony at the end of 2005, there was just on the edge of when the PlayStation 3 was about to come out. So we still had pretty early dev kits in the company. But the Sony studio was one of the few places where you could actually like program stuff on the PlayStation 3. So everything we'd done was on hardware. So we didn't have a PC editor really, or a PC version of the engine. well, you could model your stuff and your scenes and then import it and like whatnot, but the actual game itself you could only run on the console. So this was also my first time really working with consoles exclusively. But that's right, yeah. So I ended up, even though I wanted to do a lot of graphics programming, I ended up being doing a lot of tools work. But it was good. Particles is one thing I've done. Also, I created this kind of software interface so that you can automatically, when you edit the stuff, you can automatically see the values that are defined on these objects. So you can, particle system, how many particles and the color and whatnot. So as a programmer, you write these numbers in your code. You say like, okay, I want to spawn 50 particles per second, and they should be red in the beginning, and then they should be blue. And these values, like the number that is the amount and the colors and whatnot, they're just numbers in software. But if you want to have an editor for that, you need to somehow represent that and visually show it so that some VFX artists can actually go in and tweak these numbers. And I was working with a good friend of mine to essentially bring up that particle editing system and just make it useful for him. And he actually ended up, the VFX artist actually ended up moving over to Naughty Dog and worked on a lot of like The Last of Us and Uncharted games and whatnot. So yeah, that was a cool experience working there. Yeah.
And after that, you moved to LucasArts. So
that's true. Yeah.
At what point during your time at Sony did you tell yourself that it's time to apply for a position at LucasArts?
Yeah. So what happened is that I actually was somewhat happy in London. I was pretty much doing what I enjoyed. But I still kind of hadn't fully given up on the idea of working in visual effects somehow. And at this point, I pretty much said like, oh, well, the only companies I want to work for are the world's best. So ILM or DreamWorks, Pixar, those are the kind of companies. And as part of my complaining at Sony about not actually being able to do much graphics programming and doing so much tools, they said like, all right, fine, we'll send you to SIGGRAPH. You can go, which is the graphics conference I was talking about earlier that I presented at myself. So as part of a Sony employee, I flew, I forget which year that was, must have been 6 or 7, I guess, probably more like 6. And I was in Los Angeles. And at that conference, I ended up talking to a lot of people just at parties and at the career booth and whatnot from these animation companies. So I talked to people from ILM and Lucasfilm Animation, which was brand new back then. They didn't really had released anything, but they were starting to work on stuff, DreamWorks and whatnot. And so I just was gathering business cards. And after the conference, I wrote all of these people, like pretty much applied to all of them, but not to like the official channels of applying to the job portal, but rather than sending emails to these people I had talked to. I realized it's probably easier if you can get your resume into the stack internally somehow, rather than coming through as a completely unknown person through the application portal. But a part of that, I got talking to someone who was working at ILM or was recruiting for ILM, and he was like, well, we like what you're doing, but, I don't think you're ready to work at ILM yet. But have you considered working for LucasArts? Because they really need programmers. And I was like, well, maybe that sounds cool. But, I'm working in games right now. I don't know if I want to move to America just to make games. So I wasn't actually initially convinced. And this also I should mention, so this was 2006, 2007. LucasArts really hadn't done much. Their golden era had kind of ended. And they were kind of in this time of tumult, and there wasn't not many games were released. It was certainly not like adventure games that I grew up with that were being released. It was kind of a company that we were like, well, did they make anything recently? So I wasn't sure if I wanted to go there. But then this recruiter put me in touch with like the head of the technology group at LucasArts. Really friendly guy. And we were just talking via email, and he was like, you know what? Okay, I understand that you don't want to move right now. But maybe something will change, and let's stay in contact. And then maybe about half a year later or so, he sent me an email like, oh, you know what? I'm going to be in London for some kind of trade show. Do we just want to meet up and, just talk a little bit? And I was like, all right, fine. Let's go and talk to this guy. And it ended up being kind of like essentially like an interview. So we talked about math and graphics programming and stuff like that. And I guess I must have said enough stuff to convince him that I had some experience at this point. And then when he flew back to the US, I got an email from him and saying, it was really great talking to you. Can I just fly you out to San Francisco and you come and you interview at a couple of teams here? And he was like, and maybe you'll take the job, maybe you won't. Just come over and see. And I was like, what? Really? You're going to fly me out? You're going to pay for the ticket for me to fly to San Francisco just to talk to some people there? Sure, I'm going to jump on that. I mean, it's, at this point in my career, I was like, well, that's possible? People do that? That seems like crazy. So I jumped on that opportunity. And so 2007, in this late summer, I guess, I flew to San Francisco and walked from the hotel that was like somewhat downtown to the Presidio, where the Letterman Drive, where the LucasArts studios were located at this point, and interviewed at several teams. And I pretty much immediately fell in love with San Francisco. It's a wonderful city. I also really liked actually being there. And part of the reason is if you go to LucasArts, and that's still true now. I just visited a friend last year who works at ILM. It's pretty much walking into your childhood, because not only did LucasArts make all the games that you grew up with, right? So you have big posters of Monkey Island, Data Tentacle, all these games, and you have some of the Star Wars games, Indiana Jones, but also there's the whole place is like littered with movie props from ILM. So you walk in and there's a Darth Vader standing there. I mean, there's a Yoda statue right in front of the building, and there's like the Slimer maquette from the Ghostbusters, so like the physical thing that they had some controllers that they can move around. That was there. There was the matte painting from Ghostbusters 2 was there, the big one, that the dude steps out of. And so I was just, it was just absolutely incredible. And so all of that, being in that environment, and then stepping out of the building. So where LucasArts and ILM is located is in this beautiful place called the Presidio, where it's on this kind of little hill, and it's San Francisco, California. It's nice and sunny on that day that I was there. And you can see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. You can see it out from inside the building. I did some of the interviews in office rooms where I could see the Golden Gate Bridge there. And it was just all was like idyllic. It's, so how could I not go and work for LucasArts? So I flew back and I got, got the feedback from the teams there that they really liked me and they would like to hire me. And I said, yes, sure, let's do this. So at the very end of 2007, they paid for my flight and my move, like all the moving costs, like they moved all my stuff over there. And so at the beginning of 2008, like, the first days of January, I started working there. It was cool.
And what was the interview process like?
It was mostly conversations. I mean, there were some people who were asking some technical questions, but really nothing too bad. And I don't really remember doing any like whiteboard interviews, which was kind of back then kind of infamous. Some of the companies you talk to, they would make you stand at a whiteboard and, derive various equations from, you have a car driving from this and from that. Like, how would you calculate if they intersect and where and what? And it wasn't like that. That part of the reason is the team that I ended up joining was not a Star Wars nor an indie team, but it was a brand new initiative where they had just had the core of the team and they were all like super creative. So what they were really looking forward for were personality match with this group rather than hardcore technical skills. So maybe I would have flunked if they would have really drilled down the technical. I don't know. But mostly what I remember from the interview process is sitting in meeting rooms and just talking shop about the creative process and just. I mean, when I interview, which hasn't happened in many years now, I tend to go in with my laptop and I show stuff that I've done. And, I'm usually very excited about the things I program. So I'm like, look at this, I wrote this ray tracer and this and that and blah, blah, blah. So like, I could show them that I have this energy that they were looking for as somebody who just is creative and wants to do cool stuff. But yeah, so that's what I remember from the interviewing process.
And did you mention that you played Zach McCracken in Maniac Mansion when you were a kid? Or did you leave out that part?
I wish I remember that, whether or not I mentioned it. I learned, a couple of months later when I was actually there, that actually talking about the adventure games with the president that was there when I joined was not a good thing. It was kind of a no-go topic. Jim Ward was the president at this point, and his whole motto was the past is the past. Like we don't need to worry about these old adventure games. We're doing new stuff. We're doing The Force Unleashed was the big Star Wars title. They had this Indiana Jones game that they had already shown some parts of at E3. With this like physics character thing where he's holding on to like a streetcar and also fighting. They were doing that. So this is the kind of games that they were making, and the team that I was hired on, like I said, wasn't a Star Wars nor Indiana Jones team. Was like a brand new IP that was kind of almost like in a Blade Runner kind of environment. So like a science fiction environment where it's more like being a detective, so very Blade Runnery. Yeah, so that's the team I joined. But yeah, I did not mention adventure games in the beginning because I learned pretty quickly from other people that you should probably not mention that because the management will just tell you to shut up about it.
So what can you tell me about that first project you worked on?
I loved it. It was great. I mean, it was cool to be in a project at this early of a stage. Like it was what we would call these days, like in the dream phase or prototyping phase. So I came in and I was paired with designers, and we were trying to figure out how do you actually represent solving a crime scene. Like how do you represent that visually so that it can become like a gameplay mechanic you can do with a controller. And so we were just prototyping. I was writing little tools on the PC just to see what we could do, and it was this creative time to just do whatever you want. Like you could explore whatever. It just was so early in production. It was was a lot of fun. Absolutely amazing. We really never made it out of this phase because just a couple of months after I joined, Jim Ward, which I mentioned, the president, he disappeared, and a new management, a new CEO or president for LucasArts came in, Daryl, and because of when you have management being completely replaced, often there's a lot of turmoil and things get restructured and projects disappear and whatnot. And our project just disappeared overnight because they had invested so much money in The Force Unleashed and Indiana Jones that they said, okay, we're going to focus on the things that we know, but we're not going to focus on the things that we don't know. So they axed our team, and it was like heartbreaking because the team that we had was just amazing people. There was a lot of people kind of roughly around my age in a similar life situation, just young people at this point, most of them without family or just moved to San Francisco from Europe or other places. And we all came because our love of the original LucasArts and because we wanted to do creative things. And now you had this team from one day to the other without a project. And this is actually where my story starts, how I end up on your podcast. Because we all realized the reason why we came to LucasArts is because we love these original adventure games. We all grew up with Monkey Island, and so we were sitting in the office being kind of down because our project isn't anymore. And one of my friends was saying, you know what we should do? We should go into the archive and we should see if we can find the Monkey Island source code. And so he went off and looked for it and actually found it. And he was like, look at this, it's just a C engine and we can run it and whatnot. And you had, actually some programmer had done like a Windows implementation of it at this point. That wasn't ScumVM. That was like a native client Windows. So we could run it on a PC.
Was it Aaron Childs?
Was it there? What? No, it was EJ. Which you should probably also should talk to. He's a very interesting guy. EJ had been like there since the early days of LucasArts, so I think EJ may have even overlapped with Tim. Well, Tim Schafer was still at LucasArts. I think I don't know. Somebody should fact check this. But at the same time, so here's the other killer fact. At the same time, what happened is that the iPhone was released. So I remember vividly walking or riding my bike down Chestnut Street, which is kind of a street towards the Presidio where LucasArts is. And there was this Apple store. And I vividly remember people lining up around the building, around the corner, really long to pick up their, iPhone 1. They had people in the office with the first iPhone and, had those weird like sound machines on it because, of course, what are you going to do with a phone that had no real good apps? So people put silly stuff on it. But we were like, you know what we should do? We have this Monkey Island running on Windows. We should see if we can get it running on that phone because wouldn't it be cool if you had a real cool game on this phone? And this is pretty much how the special edition started with these two things, that our project disappeared. We were all kind of frustrated and we all had this build up creative energy that we had in this team that needed to be released in some way or the other. And we essentially just focused it while management wasn't looking. While the whole company management structure was changing from one president to the other, we were starting and just working on this project, the special edition, as essentially like a skunkworks project. So nobody ever told us you should do this. We just said, gosh darn it, we're just going to start working on that. And, if they're going to fire us, well, that's just what it is. But we're just going to start working and see how far we get. And turns out we got pretty far before management took notice. At this point, we actually had it running on the iPhone, and we showed them the progress we have made. And we convinced Daryl that this was a valid project. And then he let us finish it and released it. And, it was great. It was great.
And how long did it take you guys to get it running on an iPhone?
It wasn't actually that long. I think the whole project may have been 9 months or 10 months or something like that. So we had the benefit, like I said, that we had this Windows version already. So we had the C code compiling. We could just take that and just compile it for an iPhone. Copy the original pack files on there that contain all the data. So you could actually run the original version. We had the original version running, the original VGA version, pretty soon. Getting the audio to work was a bit more tricky because the audio interface was very different and whatnot. But visually, you could like tap on the screen and walk guybrush around pretty soon. I don't remember exactly when that was. But then we kind of we realized that maybe we can do more. Like obviously, just releasing the original game is one thing, but we have these really high resolution screens. Maybe we can just like create new art for that. So we would run the original game, but then just put new art on top of it to just make it look nice in HD. And that's pretty much what we ended up doing. So we extracted all the sprites out of the game and exported them, wrote an export process that put that stuff into Photoshop, and then we could give those Photoshop files to the artist, and they created paint over versions both for the environments and for the characters. And then we got those back into the game. So it would draw the high resolution HD art. Now, one thing that the special edition is pretty known for these days, in fact, all of the remasters we've done, is that you can switch between the original and the high resolution art version. And this was actually a feature we didn't initially well, we weren't sure if we're going to do that. Like my boss was, the programming lead was like, I don't know if we have time for this. Like this game needs to be out like in whatever couple of months. I don't know if we can do like a switch between the two versions. And I was like, no. This is just, this is, you're young, you're naive. You can just, you have the feeling that you can do anything. So I just went and went over the weekend and implemented that feature, saying like, look here, we can totally do this. We just take like two textures. One contains the original version and one contains the new version. We can just blend between those. And then when I showed this to the team back then, everybody was like, wow, this is amazing. And this is also the feature. This is the version that we then showed to the new president, Daryl. So we showed him, here's the original. Isn't that cool that you can have the original Monkey Island on your iPhone? But look at this, you can swipe, and whoa, now you have like the high resolution art. And I think this is kind of how we pitched it and convinced management that this is a good thing to do. And then we went further. Now that we had this in production, we wanted to do better audio. So we got, because Monkey Island 1 never had a talkie version, right? We got Dominic Armato, which is the voice of Guybrush in Monkey Island 2 and the later ones, to come in and record his lines, Guybrush lines. So we created a talkie version. We recorded live band music that had to be played instead of the original like iMuse, like MIDI version and whatnot. So we did end up doing a lot of technical work. We also released it not just on the iPhone, but also on the Xbox 360 as part of the XBLA initiative, and of course on the PC as well. But yeah, that was a real fun project, and that was kind of like a dream come true. Like, right, how often in life are you going to be able to come back and work on something that shaped your childhood? But you can actually make a product out of it that other people appreciate. Was magical.
And so the game that was running in the background in a sandbox, it was that Windows version you found? It wasn't a DOSBox variant or a ScumVM variant? It was
No. LucasArts was very concerned about being sued. So like at least once a year you had like a legal training where some lawyer came and told you that you cannot look up any technology online. Like if you're trying to search for an algorithm, don't search online. I don't know how they think programmers work. I have no idea, because they were just so worried that the company would be sued for whatever reason. But the bottom line here is that we did not touch ScumVM. We didn't even look at, because ScumVM is open source. We didn't even look at the source code or any of that stuff because we just didn't want to get anywhere near this for legal reasons. We only used the version that we found internally in the archive. And from what I remember is that we took the Win32 version, and that's pretty much what everything is based on, because EJ had done the hard work of taking the DOS implementation, and that required some assembly in addition to C, to actually just make a whole entire implementation in C, so you could just compile it and it would run nicely in a 32-bit environment. So this was our starting point. So he did a lot of work for us to even make this possible, I guess.
So you said that you had to extract all of the assets. So in order to figure out which assets you needed to remaster, you extracted all of them. But did you come across any unused assets during this extraction operation?
Yes, we came across some rooms. I actually not see, this is the thing where my buddy would have much better recollection because he wrote all the extraction tools for it. I do remember that we found stuff. We were like, whoa, we've never seen this sprite or this part of the game. There was in other games later. I mean, that's later in Grim Fandango. There was this whole weird test environment that Tim said he told the programmer to remove, but it still ended up in the game. And so you find stuff. This is kind of part of, actually, I love this process. That's what I call game archaeology, where you go in and you look at how these games were made and their data and their code and their scripts and all that stuff. And it's such a fun process because you get a glimpse into the life of the game development team back in the day when they were working on that. And that's just such a fascinating thing to investigate.
And how did you decide, when you found those unused assets, how did you decide whether or not to remaster them? Did you go according to your own recollection, whether you saw them in the game or not?
That's a good question. You know what? I don't really have, and I think we just realized that we had never seen them, so we probably just wouldn't put in. I mean, the thing is, it was pretty obvious. So the way we done it is that for the high resolution assets, the way we done it, we extracted the original sprites, we upscaled them so that we had a bigger version. And then we saved essentially that as the initial starting point for the remastering art. But that meant we could run the game in HD mode, even though all we had was the upscaled version of the original VGA assets. So we could play the game and we could see, well, here are the docks or the town or the governor's house or whatever. And as we started remastering environments and characters, they would start to appear in the HD version. At some point you just had all the art remastered, and there was none of the parts of the game were left where you had like the original art anymore. So we're like, okay, well, I guess these things weren't used. But yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer here, what exactly we found there.
So the Video Game History Foundation did a pretty in-depth overview of the original source code, and some of the unused assets from the game were found in their repository. So
okay.
I want to show you some of the assets, and let me know if you saw them while you were doing your digging. So we had, things like these Sam & Max placeholders.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we never done a remaster of the Sam & Max. I would love to do that. But yeah, that's very cool.
And you have also Guybrush with the red sash.
I don't think I've seen that. Must have been from which one is that? Monkey 2? What is that?
No, this is from Monkey 1. So the thing is that he had this red sash and it was removed, but you still see it in the map. So, for example, when you have Guybrush walking around, you have that red pixel. This is the red pixel.
Yeah, the map is hilarious. I never knew that this is how the map Guybrush was done until we had the HD version, and it was very apparent that all they had done to make Guybrush's dot on the map was just to take Guybrush's side walk animation and scale him down to like a small size. But obviously, if you have like 100 times more pixel density, it becomes very apparent. That bridge, roughly, that's true. Puzzle.
So we have that bridge.
Oh, the animation editor. That's also really awesome to see the animation editor that they had up there. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm. So you have some of the before and after.
Yeah. Very cool. With this, actually, yeah.
And the famous sunset that was removed in the VGA version.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there were difference between the EGA and the VGA version. Yeah. Maps. Yeah.
So yeah.
Very cool.
So you didn't run into any of these assets?
Some of them look familiar, but yeah, it's been so long that I really don't recall oohing and awing about it. I mean, the thing is, we were under pretty much pressure to get this done, right? We had to prove ourselves that we can get this done, so we really didn't have much time to sit back and enjoy our moment of glory there. We just had to prove to new management that we can get this game done and actually ship it. Yeah.
Now you ended up remastering things that weren't in the original game, like Spiffy the dog in the Scum Bar.
Spiffy the dog, yeah. That's right. I forget so I remember someone in the team was like, we should do that. We should do this close-up shot. And I don't know how it got to that. I think somebody was claiming that this existed at some point. The close-up.
Yeah, because it's on the back cover of the game, of the original game.
There you go.
But they removed it because
it was work and sometimes you just run out of time in the original. But yeah, I mean, this is the fun thing about doing the remasters, right? You can go in and you can add things and you can fix things. There was like a game-breaking bug in Monkey Island 1 where you could spend all your money on a grog machine, and then you could actually not finish the game because you had spent all your money on that machine. And so stuff like that we would actually fix, because the whole point of LucasArts Adventure games was always that you couldn't you could never lose. All you do is like you have to just go around and try to figure out what you're missing. But there were sometimes conditions where the game would end up in a state where it couldn't continue, which is called a soft lock. So we would try to fix those. And like it's nice to be able to go in and add stuff like Spiffy close up.
So Loom also has soft locks. I always thought that you couldn't reach a dead end or a soft lock in Loom, but if you forget to write down the drafts, then that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
You're done.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting listening to some of the other conversations with the original teams, and if you just think about at what crazy speed they got games out, I mean, like every year, essentially, there was a time where every year they released like a game, or even sometimes two. It's just nuts to think about it from today's perspective, where making games just requires like 5-6 years. So it's natural if you work in an environment like this where you have to, I mean, yes, they had an engine, but they still need to come up with the story. They have to design the puzzles. They have to create the art, animations, all that stuff. And you have to get it done. Like, so much pressure to make this happen that it's inevitable that you're going to have bugs in an environment like that. Yeah.
Now, the original game ran in a sandbox, and the remastered version ran in parallel to that sandbox. And you mentioned the seamless transition between them. What was the biggest challenge in making that transition? How did you sync between the animation frames of the sprites and the backgrounds and everything, so that when you zoom in or zoom out, it will be the exact same objects, just in high definition?
It looks like a really impressive feature when you play it, but technically it's actually that simple. Because we decided early on that we didn't want to do a remake, but a remaster. We very consciously decided not to, for example, increase the animation frequency. So the animation is still running at the original, like whatever it was, like 7 frames per second animation frequency. So we essentially, all we did, the whole strategy behind the remastered, the special edition version, was that we take the state of the original game that it's in, and we extract the state exactly, and we're multiplying all the coordinates of all the sprites, whatever, by a factor to get to the high resolution location, and then we're drawing the new high resolution texture there. So really, the syncing up is automatic because the original game runs. We're just taking the data out of the original game. We're just drawing the sprites, the much higher resolution sprites, at the appropriate location, and that's it. And then the fade between them is pretty trivial. You have an image that the original game produced called the frame buffer, and you have an image that the remastered version, the special edition, produced. And internally, these are just two textures, and all you do, you just essentially fade between those two. And I added this like the vertical scroll to make the verb bar disappear and whatnot. So but that's just really simple, like translation, like 2D transition animations. But yeah, that's why I'm saying, like when my boss back then said like, I don't think we should do this crossfade. That's just too much work. And I was like, no, this is really just like a blend between two images. It's easy. And of course, it's never as easy as you think, but it was easy enough that I could come back on Monday and say, here, I've done it. Look at this. It's done. It's in the game.
Now, how did you, during the remaster process, how did the team decide which animations to enhance, like create the moving water in the dock?
Yeah. A lot of that stuff was kind of a collaboration with our team and mostly me, because I was the graphics programmer on the team. So I was every day I would walk into the lead artist's office and we would talk about what they're doing and what the hiccups they're running into with the tools and what they need. And like one day we were just talking because we were playing. We had the super high resolution version of the docks with the water and Guybrush walking around. But something you don't really think about it when you start remastering process of these old DOS games is that when you see these old DOS games on an old CRT monitor, your brain does a lot of the heavy lifting to make things look really cool. I mean, yes, they did like palette animation back then to create like the suggestion of movement, but that's really difficult to do in the high resolution version. And then all you have left in the high resolution version is like the static image of the water and the dogs and Guybrush walking in front of it, and it looks actually kind of not so good because it looks way too static. And so the lead artist was like, well, is there something we can do to make this water just move it somehow? And, I looked at how the original water was made and with some palette animations, and realized we can't really do that. But what we can do is just use the graphics card that we have and just use some shader tricks to essentially wobble the image a little bit to make it look like there's water waves that are coming towards you. And I think that is another feature that I actually implemented over the weekend and came back with a prototype on Monday to show like, we can totally do this. Because all of this was additional stuff, right? We initially didn't really think we would do any enhancement along those lines. But then, I created a pipeline for it, and we had the shader for that stuff, and we could just put the water waves on stuff, and we just did that in the scenes where we had water. And then I actually I got some time to essentially go over all the environments and just see at what needs to be done to just add some effects. Because like in Monkey Island, right, Guybrush gets like tossed into the water where he's down there with this idol attached to his leg, and we want to do some little wobbling there of the water. And actually, something I'm still very proud of is the LeChuck's ghost aura. So if you see LeChuck, he has this like swirly dust, smoky stuff coming off his body. That was probably the most complicated visual effect I've written for that game, because it required like kind of figuring out where LeChuck is, and then kind of taking that information of his color and like moving it around in some way that makes them look ghostly. And I remember that was another thing where on Friday afternoon, the lead artist came to me and was like, with LeChuck, is there something we can do to make him look more ghostly? And this is how I went into the weekend. It's like, what do you do to make him look more ghostly? Well, we need something fluffy and swirly around him. And I started prototyping that idea and came back with some really rough prototype, and we liked it and then just refined it. But yeah, a lot of these additional effects were like a labor of love that often happen outside of like regular work hours, because we really, really weren't scheduled for. But it's something that I felt very strongly about, because I imagined the special edition, going out to, contemporary gamers. Of course, the people would play the game that played it back then. But really, what I wanted to make sure is that the people who will play the game then, that never seen it, would not be put off by, the static ocean and whatnot. I wanted to make sure that they can have the same magical moment that I felt when I first played the game. So, yeah.
And from a technical point of view, when you switch back to the classic version, are the animations still running in the background in the remastered version, or they pause?
No, everything runs. Everything runs at all time. Whether or not you're seeing, so if you're seeing the classic version, the special edition still produces an image, you just don't see it. And when you run in this, the remastered version, the original version is still there. You just don't see it. Everything runs at all time. Yeah.
Now, I know that your favorite scene in the game is the one in the governor's mansion, where the game plays itself. In the original, part of the joke was, seeing weird stuff being added and removed from your inventory.
That's right.
But in the remastered version, you don't see your inventory at all times. So what did you do in the special edition to preserve that humor while staying true to the design choices you made?
So here I'm going to look bad, because I don't actually remember what we did in the special. Did we show like stuff popping up or whatever? Because I don't remember how we handled that scene.
You have the verbs being used at the bottom, so you can see use, wax, lips, and such.
Okay.
So you can see what's happening, but you don't see the inventory. And the inventory was part of the joke.
Yeah, the joke. That's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, It's tough, right? I mean, it's kind of a totally like a Ron and Tim thing and Dave to have this meta joke, right? That's the whole point, is that it's breaking the fourth wall to the player, and the game is playing itself. And you're like, wouldn't it be funny if the game would just play itself and stuff would, right? We were doing stuff automatically, adding things to the inventory. I can just see the three of them sitting somewhere in the old LucasArts office, coming up with that joke and then scripting that up, and laughing their butts off doing that. But then, yeah, so stuff like that. Of course, if you don't have the interface for that, then it's difficult to fully replicate it. I think our hope was that having the talkie version that didn't exist originally would add some of the humor that maybe would get lost with some of the other aspects. Yeah.
Now, one of my favorite non-adventure games by LucasArts is the underrated jam, Lucidity. And I remember getting it on Steam and playing it nonstop back in 2009. And it seemed I was the only one. I was the only one who played Lucidity. I kept recommending this game to people, and nobody heard about it. I think that the marketing of the game wasn't that good.
Yeah.
But it's a great game. I still love it to this day. I just played it the other day. Still super fun.
Well, here's the thing. Can I say one thing to that?
Sure.
The marketing actually, the thing is, so I mentioned that when I joined, we had one president, and then within a couple of months, we had another president. So this happened again. This happened like at 2 times while I was at LucasArts. So Daryl, the president of LucasArts, left or whatever, and a new president came in. After his name, I just forgot now. And so this was about that time when we were releasing Lucidity, so the company was kind of in shambles again. And so getting the company to spend any money on anything that's not supporting Star Wars was very difficult. And it's a shame, because I do think, we put a lot of our creative juices into that game, and it's a shame. It was one of the first original IP that LucasArts had released in many, many years. And it's just such a shame that they didn't really want to promote it more. It just was too small, right? For LucasArts is known for these big games. We're going to make big games. We're going to make like Star Wars Unleashed. We're going to make whatever. Indiana Jones is going to be cinematic, huge experiences. This is the kind of stuff that we do. And because of that, they just didn't know how to handle a small game like that, or didn't want to. So yeah, it's a big shame. It was a lot of fun working on that project.
So yeah, it was LucasArts' attempt to get back to its original experimental roots. Back in the days when George Lucas would say that one of the mottos is "Don't lose money," and since then it's changed to make a lot of money. So games like Lucidity usually wouldn't get made by LucasArts, which is why it surprised me that a game like this would be produced by LucasArts. Now, you're credited as a graphics engineer on the game. What can you share about the game's production?
It was a very short timeline. So the team I was originally hired on was called Team 3. And then we had the special edition team that kind of came out of that. And then at the end of special edition, we kind of named our group that we were in and called it Lucas Labs. And the mandate for Lucas Labs was, like you said, to make a lot of very small games. And the initial idea was to release 4 games a year. That was the initial goal. And so you can see we picked very small experiences, and the idea was to kind of stagger them. And we actually had other games in production that never made it, which is a shame. And really, I did more. So I'm credited as graphics programmer because this is what I wanted to make sure is in the credits, so that I can put it on resumes. But I did a lot more than that. I wrote, for example, the game editor. Is pretty much came from me. Like we had the problem that we had to go so fast that people were starting to make the game with text files, so the designers would lay out the Lucidity maps with text files, which is what the original game jam that we had done internally at LucasArts, the very short, 1 week game jam. That's how it was done. But we very quickly ran into problems like, well, you can't just make a whole game where you just have an Excel sheet where you put stuff in. That's kind of crazy. So I went into the office one weekend, and I pretty much spent the whole weekend in the office to implement that editor to make it usable for design and art. And I should have not done that. Like, this was the time where I definitely worked way more than I should have done. And I was also really grumpy on Monday because I worked the whole, the whole weekend. But I did get the job done. I wrote the editor. I wrote huge parts of the graphics engine. I wrote the particle system, a lot of that stuff. Yeah, I didn't do much gameplay on that project, so it's mostly on what's pretty much my role now, which is systems and graphics, and sometimes tools. Yeah.
Okay. And the following year, in 2010, you were credited as a visual effects engineer on Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge Special Edition. What were some of the visual effects you worked on for this game?
I forced myself into that project. So we had at this point we had the special edition for Monkey 2 was mostly handled by the Singapore studio. So we had a satellite studio in Singapore where we also had an animation studio there. But we had a games team, and since we had finished special edition and we were working on these Lucas Labs 4 projects a year, we couldn't do another remaster. But the thing is, what you said, George said, don't lose money. The thing is, the special edition actually made money. That game sold well, and it made its development cost, multiple times over. So the company was like, oh, well, I guess there's money in this, so I guess we should make another one of those. So they had the Singapore studio doing a lot of that work. I think some of the art production actually may have been done in San Francisco. But the game was very close to being released, and I looked at a version that they had, and I realized that it had none of these special things that I added so painstakingly to Monkey Island 1, like the animating water and the ghost aura for LeChuck. They just didn't have a graphics programmer on their engineering team, or at least not someone who felt as passionate about it as me. So I saw the version of Monkey Island Special Edition, or Monkey Island 2 Special Edition, and I played it, and I was like, dude, we cannot release the game the way it is. And I went to the producer's office, Craig, who is still now at LucasArts, and I said, you have to give me some time. You have to give me like 2 or 3 weeks so I can go in. You have to get me off the project I'm on right now, which I think may have already been what later became 1313. And you have to let me add special effects to this game. And he was like, I don't know if I can do this. All right, fine. So he somehow pulled strings, and I had like 2 weeks, and I had pretty much free reign. So I was like, do as much as you can in 2 weeks. So I went through, I assessed the game, what we had, and I looked at the original version, looked at all the things that they had. There was this explosion in the castle. There's a shot where you have this kind of castle background. There's this explosion, stuff like that. I said, like, okay, well, let's write all the things down. And then I pretty much just like sat down and I hacked like crazy to get all these effects in for the various rooms. And yeah, it was very stressful, but ultimately very gratifying. So that's hence why I got the visual effects artist or like programmer credit for that game, because I went in like at the very end of the project and just like hacked in as many visual effects as I can possibly get in that time frame. And I'm glad I did, because I think it adds a lot to the game. I mean, I remember playing the game at Monkey 2, you have the scene right on the island where there's a waterfall. And in the original version, they used palette animation and a beautiful, like this, this beautifully painted environments back then where they had the palette animation and just beautiful, the water coming down. And in a special edition that I got to, somebody had placed like a particle thing on there. So, they could use some of the tools we'd done, but they just didn't fully know how to use it. So it just looked like just not very good. And I was like, okay, we just cannot do that. And I went in and I tweaked all the things and implemented stuff that need to be implemented. Since I had written a lot of the code originally, I just felt like coming home, and I immediately knew exactly where all the stuff needs to go. But yeah, I'm glad I did, because I think it adds a lot. And if without it, the game would have just not been the same.
I'm also glad you did. I love that waterfall. And that waterfall in the original version is the reason I know the word picturesque, because 9-year-old me when Guybrush looks at the waterfall, he says that it's very picturesque. And so I had to look up the word in the dictionary.
Yeah.
And that's when I learned the word picturesque from that waterfall.
Yeah. Monkey had a whole bunch of things. A whole monkey wrench thing too. Anyway, yeah.
I forgive them for the monkey wrench thing because back then I would use everything in my inventory with everything on screen. So I ended up solving that puzzle. So you didn't get to work on any of the enhancements they made to the Scum engine. So, for example, in the Monkey Island 1 special edition, you didn't have the voices in the classic version. And in this game, you do have the talkie version in the classic mode as well. So you did work on the adjustments they made to the Scum engine in the original version to make it work?
No, I wasn't really involved in that, but I remember there was actually some controversy around that because people wanted to have all the options, right? They wanted to play the classic version, but with the modern talkie, or the other way around. Yeah, there's, pardon me. There's always, I like doing these projects. I learned that you can never satisfy everyone. You just can do the best you can. But yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't really involved in that aspect. I remember that Dominic Amato came in to record voices and whatnot, and I was just so busy because some of my other colleagues went to see him and chat with him and whatnot, and I just had a lot on my plate, and I just didn't really get a chance to talk to him, which is a shame because I should have done it. He's such a nice guy.
Yeah. Should have cleared your schedule.
Yeah, I really should have. This is the thing where you're young and you're just like, no, I need a program. Yeah, you learn. I would do it differently now.
Now, it says that the Monkey Island special editions, in both of them, references and graphic assets of elements which were not copyrighted by LucasArts at the time were removed from the remastered version. Did you know that?
Yep. Yeah. Oh, we discussed this so long, whether or not we can have the...
yeah. So instead of having the Salmon Max totem pole over here, you have the Tentacle totem pole.
Yeah. I personally would have made a different decision, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you do where legal comes in.
And in Monkey Island 2, you have the Max costume in the original one and the Tentacle costume in the remastered.
I think the problem was that Steve Purcell had left LucasArts. He was working for Pixar, and he actually has the IP rights to 7 Max still to this day. And so the only rights that LucasArts has, that's my understanding. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know. But my understanding is that the only rights that LucasArts has is to the game. Like if 7 Max hit the road, that's all they own. They can't make any new 7 Max art. I actually tried to pitch to Tim because he still is in contact with Steve Purcell at Double Fine to do a remaster of 7 Max Hit the Road, which obviously is not a Tim game, and to get him involved so that we can actually make new art for this game. But yeah, it's a complicated situation now with us being part of Microsoft and LucasArts not existing, being Disney. It's all these gigantic companies, and the chances of this ever happening are pretty slim. But I would still love to do that. I love 7 Max. It's probably also one of my favorite games.
But why? Lucasfilm Games is a legal entity that sells their IPs to developers, so you could get a license. And I know that Steve Purcell is up for it. When I talked to Steve Purcell about these changes in the special editions, then I asked him if he was the one who asked them to not use 7 Max in the special editions, but he said he didn't ask them to remove it. So it was just LucasArts being extra cautious.
That's right. That's what I was saying earlier. Like when you were LucasArts back then, when you were a LucasArts employee, you had the legal training once a year. So they definitely looked at the games with they went to the legal department and they took their magnifying glass and they ran it over the game to make sure there's no friction there legally whatsoever. All right, well, it's good to know that Steve is up for it. So maybe I need to talk to Tim again to see if
Steve is up for it. Even in my conversation with him, he was up for me creating a 7 Max game. So if he's up for, it was after a 4-hour conversation, so maybe he was tired. But if he's okay with me creating a 7 Max game, then I'm certain that he's okay with Double Fine remastering Sam & Max Hit the Road.
Okay.
Get Tim to talk to him.
I think it's probably Tim would be okay with it, and if Steve is okay with it, it's good to know. I think it will probably fall with the people between Microsoft and Disney to come to some kind of agreement how that project how the money would work for that thing. It's a shame.
Craig Derrick will be able to handle the situation. He revived.
I actually asked him. I asked him about this, and he was Unfortunately, we haven't made much progress on it.
Okay.
It would be nice. Maybe if you talk to him again. Yeah.
I'll contact him after the conversation.
Okay.
And the thing is, it's not just graphic assets. The script was also changed to remove references to copyrighted material. So for example, instead of saying ghost busting stud, that was changed to LeChuck busting stud.
Yeah.
And when Guybrush says, I don't suppose it's a Nintendo game, it was changed to, I don't suppose it's a LucasArts game. So, and that was done before they send the script to the voice department to record the lines.
Yeah, so, you have to hand your script off to legal, right, to get approval and whatnot. But by the time you do recording, it has gone to every possible review it can go through.
So someone had to go through the entire script, the original script, and remove the copyrighted material before sending it to Dominic Armato.
Yep.
And since you didn't work on any of the Scum engine enhancements in this game, how did you approach adapting iMuse for the remastered version of the original game?
That's a good question. And this was unfortunately, this was done since I was so focused on the whole visual side. I actually didn't end up doing a lot of work on that part. But I do remember that was tricky, right? It's a very actually challenging process because iMuse was just amazing by having this dynamic music mixing. Like the whole dock scene in Monkey 2 in the beginning where you walk down and into these different rooms, and it's just amazing how these different musical tracks blend with each other seamlessly. Magical, absolutely magical. And this works because you had them made from MIDI essentially, so you could tag the tracks, it's my understanding, to have transition points where these tracks could go from one to the other. But we didn't, for the remastered version, special edition version, we didn't really use MIDI. It was all like actually recorded audio. So that part was a bit more tricky to actually make that work. And I wish I could give you more information here, but I was so heads down on my stuff that I actually don't know exactly what was involved to get to the state that we're in now. But I remember the team, the audio people saying that they were definitely challenging. It was definitely challenging to get this all working properly.
Okay. Now, as you said, you were involved in the development of Star Wars 1313. And I was extremely excited when I first heard about the project and extremely disappointed when it was canceled. So what was your role on the project? And what can you share about the production of the game?
Sure. I mean, I should say that I was pretty much done with LucasArts at that point. I was kind of, my spirit was broken because of, I was hired to come and work on new IP. Then within weeks of me being there, management was changed and that project disappeared. Then we had a run that was magical, right? As the golden era where we did the special edition in Lucidity, and we were actually other projects in development in labs that were pretty close to being done. It's a real shame. And then management got changed again, and then labs was shut down, and they just assigned, the whole team onto. At this point, it wasn't quite clear what 1313 actually will be, right? Will it be GTA or something Uncharted? It wasn't quite clear. But since we had the situation where there was a power vacuum due to management changing, there was a lot of scrambling for, who's actually going to do what? Who's going to be the project lead? Who's going to be this and that? And what is the project actually going to be? So there was a lot of tumult internally. And this was, the version of 1313 that people seen much later it was far away from that. We were starting to work with Unreal Engine 3 at this point, And this is because the new president that came from Epic Singapore. So he essentially came in and said, okay, we're not going to use our internal engine anymore that was proprietary, but instead we're going to make this game with Unreal Engine 3. And for me, that was kind of like almost kind of a stab in the heart, because at my core, I'm a systems and engine programmer. So if somebody says use this engine where you actually can't do engine programming, then like what's the point? So my role was really to be disappointed and help out the art department a little bit. Like I did implement some tools and whatnot, but my heart wasn't in it. And the new CTO kind of also noticed that a lot of the programmers coming off the labs team were just not very productive. We were kind of disgruntled by our experience over the years of all the ups and downs, and I don't think he wanted us with our negative attitudes to be on that team. So what ended up happening is that they transferred me into this like tools project where essentially what we were tasked to do is to create something that is very akin to Unreal's blueprint these days, like a visual scripting interface for the game. But nobody really cared what we were doing. Like we would come in and have meetings and do some implementation, but ultimately nobody cared because there was so much power vacuum struggle for what's going to happen that the CTO didn't come and look at what this group of people that I relegated to this dark part of the office are actually up to. So there were days when I just didn't go into the office at all. I stayed at home and was learning some other tech. So it was a little bit heartbroken at this point because I came to LucasArts with this like magic in my eye, like look at this amazing place. And ended up in a place where, oh my gosh, this is the worst. Like, why did they do that? I did go internally. Since I, been there for a while, and I had talked to other people across the border to the ILM side. I actually went over and talked to ILM folks a little bit, but there was just not a good time for me to switch. Also, I've seen that the ILM folks are working really, really hard all the time to make movies, so I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that. So my end at LucasArts was kind of really anticlimactic and sad, unfortunately, where it just wasn't the same place anymore. All the team that I was hired on originally had all left already, mostly. There were a few people who stayed a little bit longer, but a lot of people were gone, and so I kind of felt like it's probably time for me to move on. I don't feel like I can motivate myself to really get into this project. So I really, I worked on 1313 a tiny bit in the beginning, but I had nothing to do what the team actually did in the end, which, looked pretty amazing. That really came out of a lot of the people that ended up taking charge of the project actually know what they're doing and, managing this kind of weird power vacuum effectively to get their vision done. And I'm glad they did because it was a great prototype. But yeah, for me, unfortunately, it was the end of the road, and I left LucasArts not long after that.
So, did you apply for a position at Double Fine before you left LucasArts or after you left LucasArts?
Oh, yeah, but that happened before because at this point I was like on a work visa in the US, so I couldn't just leave LucasArts. If I would have done it, the fact I would have not been able to stay in the US if I'm not employed anymore, So yeah, this is part of the, like I was saying, since nobody really cared what I was doing, I took some days to do interviews. And I really actually hadn't, I mean, I had seen the Brutal Legend trailer at this point, but I really didn't know all that much about Double Fine. I mean, I know that Tim was there, but I hadn't had that much time that I had spent with Psychonauts. But one of my former colleagues from the original team, from Team 3 and the Lucas Labs, ended up going to Double Fine. And I just ran into him one day and he was like, you know what, you should just come to the Double Fine office, just see if, just visit it. He didn't really pitch it as an interview or anything like that. So that's what I did. I just, went to the other part of San Francisco where Double Fine is. It was just kind of almost the complete opposite back then of what the Presidio is, like this pristine, nice environment. There was lush and green and the view of the Golden Gate Bridge, and Double Fine was located actually not in a bad place now, Soma, but it's kind of more industrial. And my understanding is that the original Double Fine offices were in a really, really bad place. So it wasn't quite like that, but it definitely was different. But anyway, I walked into the office there, and they were working at this point on stacking and on Once Upon a Monster. And it was just like day and night to my experience I had at this point at LucasArts. LucasArts, I was sitting in a really dark part of the office, far from any window. Nobody cared what I was doing. I felt kind of lost. And here was a place where you walk into the studio and everybody has like action figures on their desk and people are really excited about their work. And you walk around and you see games on screens and people are talking to each other. And you just immediately can feel the creative energy there. So after my visit there, I was definitely pretty impressed, and I was like, okay, this is cool. I could see myself coming here, and so my former colleague then, forwarded that information internally, and then I came back for a technical interview. Not that much later. And that interview was also great. It was really, as with a lot of the Double Fine job interviews, it's a lot about personality screening to make sure that the person who's joining the company fits into the environment. So there was a lot of just talking the whole day to various parts of the company, talking to artists and designers, and of course programmers. And again, I came with my laptop and I had like, here, some hobby projects I've done. Look at this, look at the cool stuff. And I was re-energized to come back to kind of how I interviewed originally. I went back home. I felt it went pretty well. And I think the next day I got a call from the head of production saying that they would like to hire me. Now, for me, the complication was that I had to go back to Germany to get the visa transferred to Double Fine. So I had to line all this carefully up. So I planned to start my job at Double Fine, I believe in November. Although it's now, I think the visa date I got in the end was December. But so I went back home and got my visa transferred. Then on the flight back from Europe, I also, there was a wedding. I went for a friend's wedding when I was back here in Europe, and on the flight back to San Francisco there to then join Double Fine, I actually met my wife on that plane. So that also happened. And then I joined the company there. I actually joined before the official visa date was me allowing to start working. It said I was supposed to start working at December, but I was just sitting around at home. I was, I'm just going to go in November and already start working. And I remember Tim coming by one day and it was like, wait, are you supposed to be here? And he was like, I'm not seeing anything. I'm not seeing anything. You just sit there. And so, yeah, I was very excited and started working like at the end of November or mid-November or something like that. And yeah, I ended up helping out to get stacking out of the door, which was just wrapping up. And as a part of me of learning the technology that they had, the proprietary internal engine that they had, I added some visual effects to stacking that they kind of didn't have time to do. And so, yeah, so that was awesome experience coming out of this very unsure environment into an environment that's very energetic and is just shipping games. And yeah, that was great.
And you also worked at a time on Once Upon a Monster. Mm-hmm. On Once Upon a Monster, you're credited as the lead engine programmer. And right. The game itself used Kinect. So
that's right.
What were some of the challenges, if any, in making gesture recognition accurate for kids? Yep.
Well, that part was taken care of mostly by the Xbox API. So they had a library that you could call, and it would give you essentially a skeleton So it would already do all the heavy lifting of figuring out for the depth buffer where the people are and where the skeletons are. So this part was taken care of, but it was still challenging because it was very imprecise. So you would, if you just bind your cookie monster to that skeleton, it, from frame to frame, it might pop the shoulder from one side to the other. So you have Cookie Monster like broken into some horrible, like mutilated state. And obviously we couldn't have any of that stuff. So making these kind of things was challenging. I mean, the big challenge with Once Upon a Monster was that it was an IP title. I think it's the only IP title Double Fine has ever done with external IP. And because of that, we had very well-defined but tight milestone timeline. So we need to get stuff done quickly, and was a lot of work. One of the hardest things probably, or that still is in my head now, is the designers had to test the game, and since the monsters were talking, we recorded scratch dialogue first, right? Before you go to New York and record with the actual actors who do the Sesame Street monsters, you put in scratch dialogue with people in the studio, different people like recording various roles. And one of the designers, she voiced Elmo. And so I remember, obviously it's a title where you have to stand in front of the TV and do stuff. So when you design things, you can't get around then to have this on and see if the voice response is coming. So the constant high-pitched Elmo voice all day long is still branded into my brain. And if I boot up Once Upon a Monster these days, like these early lines with Elmo like waving and meeting Marco is still like almost PTSD like, because it was just nonstop while you're trying to program. You hear like Elmo like, Marco, come over here. And it was crazy, but it was a fun project. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff we done. The fur tech was mostly already in place when I joined. I had Pete was the graphics programmer on Brutal Legend, and he had gone and implemented this really amazing fur technology, so that the monsters really looked like the one in the Sesame Street on TV. But there was a lot of stuff to be done, like using the depth cues from the Kinect with other gameplay aspects. Implemented various gameplay interactions also that require like rubbing down the monsters or whatnot, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. But yeah, that's true. That was my first time, because I joined the company as a senior programmer, and they needed somebody to be in the lead role for the engine like technical aspect. And I was very eager at this point. It was this part of my career where you're hungry for career advancements. So I always wanted to give me a lead role because I think I can handle it. And there I got a chance to do it. And the funny thing is that the only programmer I had on the engine team that I had to manage was actually Dave Dixon, who was the lead programmer of Psychonauts. So he was like way older and way more experienced than me. And I was the one who's supposed to manage this guy. But I learned a lot from that project, and it was very fun. Dave also had a tarantula in the office in a aquarium that was in our pod where we were working. So you would come in, and there's a spider crawling around there in a glass, added to the interestingness of this project.
Now, you talked about working on stacking. You worked on the PlayStation 3 version, but you're also credited on the Windows version. Did you do anything in the Windows version or in order to port for Windows, or was this credit just transferred from the PlayStation 3 version?
That was transferred because the graphical effects that I implemented for stacking just apply to all the platforms. So yeah. I don't know what the difference. So are you saying there's a difference how I'm credited differently, or is it credited
no, you're
as the
credited
same role?
the same, but I just want to know if whether or not you.
Double Fine is trying to be very fair when it comes to crediting, unlike other companies where, if you're not there at the end of the project, you're not going to get credit, even though you could have spent like 90% on a project. But Double Fine is definitely trying to do the right thing by acknowledging people who have contributed to a project. So I really appreciate that. I mean, it's a great place overall. I've been there now for who knows how long. Yeah, it's one of the aspects that make it a really great place.
Now, around the same time, Double Fine launched its very famous Kickstarter campaign, the Double Fine Adventure Kickstarter. What was the atmosphere like in the office during that time?
I mean, that was crazy because the whole Kickstarter initiative really didn't come didn't come internally, but it came mostly from Two Player Production, who was like a game documentary crew from Portland. They had made like a documentary about the making of Minecraft and whatnot. And they came to Tim with the idea of like, what if we pitch to as a Kickstarter project that you make a new adventure game and we're making a documentary alongside, and that will be the pitch. And we didn't really have, I mean, Kickstarter was new at this point anyway, and we didn't have any experience with that. So we prepared, but I personally didn't. I mean, I was working on other stuff, but I also didn't really have high hopes or anything. I honestly didn't think much about it. But it became very clear when it was launched that people were in fact very excited about this project. And that was also, that was a fun time pitching, because like once we had the success, we kept posting updates to Kickstarter, and I was even part of one of the updates, which was the fun one. That was a fun time.
And what was it like having a camera crew running around all the time while you're trying to work in the office?
That was in the beginning very weird, right? Because I came from companies with Sony and LucasArts where you were never allowed to share anything. Like even doing conference talks would partially be difficult. And now the idea was that you would just film everything. Just seemed completely nuts to me. And of course, it's a little bit awkward, right? You're sitting there, you're thinking about what you're doing, and all of a sudden you notice that somebody's setting up a camera near you and whatnot. But very quickly you get used to it, and to a huge degree, that's all thanks to Two Player Productions. Like the two Pauls, Paul Owen, Paul Levering, and Asif are the three people. Two Player Productions. So I think there's three people. Are just so super nice and friendly that they just fit into Double Fine, and so very quickly you just get used to the fact that the camera's rolling and you're just doing your job. And at some point, honestly, and it sounds really weird, you don't even think about it anymore. It's just what happens. I mean, sometimes you work and you realize you haven't even noticed that there's a camera set up somewhere. So then you notice it and you make a funny face to the camera because it's a weird situation. But overall, you just get used very quickly. And I mean, it was weird because with Broken Age, the documentary was released during the production of the game. So you had people a month or two later seeing what you did like 2 months ago. And it never in my life had I ever a situation where, I'm somewhere. So I drove down from San Francisco. Well, actually, drove down. There's this beautiful coastal road called Big Sur. And so my wife and I drove down there one weekend, and we were sitting in a restaurant, just minding our own business, when somebody just came up to me and said, like, "Hold on, I've seen you on that documentary," and that was just like so bizarre. Like, never had this happen to me. Was you get recognized somewhere, because who am I? I'm just a programmer, and that was weird, but it was cool. I actually really got adjusted and appreciate this very open development process very quickly. I mean, it was coming also with the fact that we were actively writing blog posts or forum posts about our development process. And I realized I actually really enjoy sharing the information that what we're doing. And, then the forum was a very supportive environment where people were appreciative of the fact that we're doing that and had questions and whatnot. And that was really nice. But yeah, then of course we were still an independent studio and actually having the money. So the thing is, we were asking for, whatever, $300,000 or something like that, right? I forget the exact amount, and we got way more. We had upwards of 3 million. So the fact that we were then saying like, okay, I don't think we can make the full game with that amount of money was definitely stressful, because we were an independent studio and like we had to find ways to get money to make this game. And of course, it had ballooned out. Like for Tim, he once he starts to think about this universe that he can create and the story that he can tell, obviously he wants to do it justice and come up with a big story and whatnot. So from this initial idea of making a small little adventure that maybe we had like one programmer and one artist and Tim, and that would be it probably, it definitely changed to a much, much bigger project that it in the end became. Yeah.
Now, during that time, during the filming of the Double Fine documentary, you also worked on The Cave with Ron Gilbert, who created
That's right. Yeah.
your favorite point-and-click adventure game.
Yep.
And in that game, you're credited for graphics programming. And so, what was your role exactly, and what graphics did you program?
Right. This was my in-between project between Once Upon a Monster and Broken Age, was The Cave, really. I did a lot of graphics programming for this project. Like there's this, and I think in the beginning of the game, this pool that you jump into with the characters. So there's like a little wobbly surface for the pool water. But then I brought back my LeChuck ghostly aura to this game, because in the cave, the whole point of the game is you're going down into a cave. And what do we know about caves? Well, it's kind of like musky and dusty in there. So I was like, wouldn't it be cool if you had like ground fog in the cave where you can walk through and it would like swirl around? And I was like, well, actually, I implemented this before in Monkey Island Special Edition. So let me just see if I can take that core idea and implement that and change it so that it works for the fog. And it actually is pretty dominantly featured, I think, in the initial opening scene of the cave, right? You have the cave text, like the text on screen, and there's like little swirly stuff coming off that. That's the fog tag. That was a lot of fun to work on that. And yeah, working with Ron, I didn't really have too much like direct personal overlap with Ron. Ron is kind of like he's a more like a close person, at least while he was working in the office with us. And so I chatted with him a little bit for various times and whatnot, but it's not that I unfortunately didn't spend as much time with him as, with Tim and whatever. But yeah, it was a fun project. I really liked working on that. Yeah.
Now, in 2014, you were credited as the lead programmer for Broken Age. Now, as we talked before, the project was initially a smaller project, which expanded significantly when the Kickstarter campaign ended. Were there any major technical adjustments that were required in order to accommodate the larger scope?
Yeah, for sure. So initially, when we were talking about the initial Kickstarter project, from a technical perspective, probably what we would have done would have been a Flash game. I think that's what we would have had money for with the initial amount of money that we had asked for. But with this larger chunk of money, and it would already, be obvious that Tim would design a much bigger game with that, we decided that Flash would not be a good technology base to do this. But in our internal engine that we had used for Brutal Legend originally, and then Once Upon a Monster and Stacking and all Costume Quest, all these other games, it's like at its core a 3D game engine. So making a 2D adventure game with that just seemed like a lot of overkill and complicated. So we ended up deciding to go with an open source 2D framework called Moai by Zipline Games. And the reason for that is because since we were an independent game studio, we knew that one way of making money is to make this game accessible to as many people as possible. So we wanted to make sure that the game will be on mobile, on Windows, on Mac, on Linux. In fact, that was all part of what we promised on Kickstarter, right? We promised Windows, Mac, and Linux. And so right away, it was obvious that we need to support all these different platforms, and that actually had huge technical implications. And that's pretty much what I started to think about heavily right from the beginning of the project, like because you're starting from scratch. There was nothing there, right, other than an engine that can draw some sprites. You have to put the framework on top of it that actually represents the game. And with every technical decision that we made in the team, I made sure that we take into account that this game will have to run on like iOS and Android devices, which were much more limited from a rendering performance perspective than what the PC can do. So there was a lot of heavy lifting we've done. I mean, the game is based on the Moai engine, but we added a lot of tech on top of that. There's really just the core shells of the open source that we're using. All the rest of like the animation technology, the backgrounds, the particles, the asset streaming, a lot of that stuff is all our tech. I mean, the whole data pipeline in the background, how you author all that stuff, we wrote all of that. And I had my hands in a lot of these pipelines and part of the engine. It was a lot of fun. But my role was mostly to do the system side. So making sure that technically everything will work. And I know that we can be on mobile devices as well as on PC. And thankfully, we had Anna Kipnis, who was leading the gameplay initiative. And Anna is really, really close with Tim, and they had worked very closely on Psychonauts. So Anna knew how Tim works from a design perspective. So having her as the lead gameplay programmer was great because she could bridge that gap between the technical team and Tim and how we're going to drive all of that process forward. And yeah, we had a great programming team and the team in general, amazing people on that team. Yeah.
So the following year, in 2015, you were credited as the lead graphics programmer for Grim Fandango Remastered. And Grim Fandango Remastered, like the Monkey Island Special Editions, added achievements to the game. Now, one of them is called The Right Way, and its description reads, play the whole game with tank controls. Tim demanded this achievement. So first of all, I have to ask, did Tim actually demand this achievement?
Oh, yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he was very proud of himself to get that achievement in there. Tim is really a proponent of the tank controls. He's a big fan of them. There was a huge debate at a company and with Tim, like whether or not, we should do the other ones. But obviously the other control modes is just much better for people who are not Tim.
Or humans.
But for him, the tank controls is the way to play that game.
And how does that achievement work exactly? Because I didn't get it. I didn't play the tank controls. I used the newly integrated mouse functionality. So how does it work exactly? If I move the mouse at all, does that disqualify me? Or can I move the mouse as long as I don't click on anything? How strict is it exactly?
From what I recall, it's really when you click on something is when you get disqualified. I think you can move the mouse, but you can't control Manny in any way with anything else other than the tank controls. That's my recollection. Somebody might correct me because I wasn't really involved in the gameplay side in that project. But I think that's how that worked.
Now, in the Nintendo Switch version of Grim Fandango, it seems that you're credited as code archaeologist. Why was that?
Because this is the credit I wanted to have since Monkey Island Special Edition. But nobody would give it because it's like it's a silly credit that they're not going to put it. If you at LucasArts come and say, put me a code archaeologist in your credits of your game, they'll say like, what? No, we're not going to do that. You're a programmer. That's what the credit you're going to get. But for the Switch version, I pretty much did by myself. I scheduled it out and I got a Switch dev kit and I just went ahead as like a one-person team to port the the console version that we had to the Switch. And because of that, since it was a port after the remaster, I was able to convince folks that I can have my silly credit finally after years of asking for it. But yeah, that was a fun project. The Switch, yes, just for several months at home, just going through making that game work on the Switch. Very satisfying.
Now, the original version of Grim was extremely buggy. So, what were some of the outstanding bugs you remember having to fix for the remastered version?
Yeah, there were several. I remember. Oh, I'm gonna get the name of the characters wrong now. There was this bug in the game where you had these little like skeleton kid-like creatures like in a cage, and there was something about if you talk to them in the wrong order, you couldn't proceed, and in some kind of soft lock. And we actually had to go. So the thing is with Grim Fandango remastering, we actually had the original code and script. And unlike with the other remasters we've done, like Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle, we weren't quite as dogmatic. We said, okay, it's fine to change the gameplay scripts if it serves the purpose of fixing bugs. And that's partially because Grim Fandango was just much more buggy. So the idea of using the techniques we had used in the past to fix bugs would have been difficult. I actually gave a GDC talk on that topic together with Mark Cook. We worked on that together. If people are still interested in seeing more of me after this podcast, you should go and watch that GDC talk where it's all about how do you fix things in old games. But yeah, so we changed Lua, but sometimes it was tricky to even like figure out how do you end up there and just understanding how that works. So I don't remember too many other like bugs, but I think Mark was mentioning one where you could end up in a soft lock talking to the character, and there were just so many of those, and we tried to fix as many as we could. But my part of the role was mostly I did a little bit of gameplay bug fixes at the end, but my main role was to get visually the remastered version, to look good and set up the pipeline for that and make sure that the artists could have their lighting in the game and whatnot. And yeah.
And just so you know, in my conversation with lead developer Brett Mogilevsky, he showed me a list of all of the bugs the game shipped with. He just printed it out. It was an entire book.
Brett is awesome. He's very he's very honest about that stuff. And it was funny because Brett came to our talk at GDC, and we were like, look, we have these problems with switching to the camera relative controls, and he was afterwards like as a question to the whole audience, like, wait, what? I think we fixed it in the original. I swear we fixed this. And that was very funny. Yeah, Brett is awesome. Nice guy.
Yeah, I saw that GDC talk the other day, and you guys were talking about bugs in the original game, and then you said that he's in the audience, and it was, at least you could have said that the game was extremely stable and just shipped with a few minor bugs.
Yeah. No, Brett is awesome. And he came to the office before, and whatnot. He's a very nice guy. Yeah.
The following year, in 2016, you were credited as the lead programmer on Day of the Tentacle Remastered. First of all, I just have to say that, in my opinion, this should be the blueprint of how a great remaster is done. It stays true to the original while expanding and enhancing the experience.
Yeah.
I know that you worked on the Monkey Island special editions, but the art style changes made it more of a special edition and not a remaster.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Sorry, you go ahead.
And so what I wanted to ask was, what lessons from the development of the Grim Fandango remaster did you bring into this project?
Actually, they are kind of disparate. There are not that many. There's not that much overlap because Grim was just such a different, like the 3D environment, or 2.5D. The actual environments are 2D, but the character is 3D. It's very different. I mean, it's just so the thing is, I had worked on the special editions at LucasArts, but Grim Fandango Remastered was mostly done by folks who had never done a remastered version. So it was like training up the people. And we actually, the company we worked with to help us with the implementation of the remastered version for Grim Fandango, Shiny Shoe, they also are the ones that worked with us on the remastered version of Data Tentacle and Full Throttle. So it was kind of a good way of getting them into the mindset, how we're going to work and using the original assets, extracting stuff and using that, upscaling and all the bugs that you run into. So it was more like learning the process of running a remaster project. That, in my opinion, is kind of the takeaways we had. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about bugs for a bit. So a couple of weeks ago, I hopped onto Day of the Tentacle Remastered live stream on Twitch. Now, you know those rotating newspaper cutscenes in the game?
Oh, yeah.
Well, during the stream, one of them played, but after the cutscene ended, the music just kept looping.
Uh-oh.
Now, since the streamer was in classic mode, I suggested switching to the remastered version, but that didn't help either. So in the end, he had to quit the game and reload the save game to fix it. But anyway, I captured a clip of it and told the streamer I'd show the issue to the lead programmer of the remaster. So here it is.
It's something we missed.
Time to debug online.
I don't know why it keeps doing that. I don't know if it's trying to tell me something.
Oh. Weird, yeah.
Out of order.
I mean, the beginning of the game, we also looked at so much during development. Yeah.
Switch back to the remaster version.
I told him to switch back.
You know the devs, right? Tell them about the bug. Tell them about the bug, please.
I can't believe you didn't find that. That's for sure. That is surprising.
What? It's still... Okay, no. So I remember this where you go to sound.
So then he switched to the remastered.
The sound settings. Let's see. Wait, it's gone.
Yeah, that's weird. Nope, there it is.
There it is. Okay, this happened.
My question is, what kind of bug is this? Is this a bug from the original version that somehow made its way into the remaster? Or is it a remaster-specific bug that's affecting the classic version?
That is a very good question. I can't really say. I mean, it could be both. It could be the original game for some reason ending up in a state where it's re-triggering in iMuse, right? Just some kind of sound cue. But it could also be... So in Day of the Tentacle, we've definitely done more state mutation that we've done in the past. So by state mutation, I mean in the Monkey Island, we mostly just looked at the original game to extract out the information about where Guybrush is and some of the other stuff, right? And we sometimes poked back into the original game to fix bugs, but we tried to do this as little as possible. But of Day of the Tentacle, we definitely were like, okay, well, we have to fix bugs, sometimes go back and poke the original game. So it's possible that some of that has gone wrong. It is weird because, like I said, this beginning part of the game would have been the one part that would have been tested so much when you get QA and inside the team. So it is weird that we never ran into that. But yeah, we would need to, essentially what I would need to do is reproduce it with the compiler attached or the debugger attached and just see where it's coming from. Is it like a queued iMuse command that gets re-triggered, or is it something else that we're doing? But yeah.
My guess is that if it's a cutscene that's skipped and the iMuse queue is already set, then it never leaves the queue.
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
Now, one thing I noticed about your approach at Double Fine is that, unlike LucasArts, you guys didn't seem too worried about the Sam and Max references in the game. And Max's portrait over here stayed as is in the remastered. Like it's no big deal. Exactly.
Well, it is not a big deal because Tim knows Steve and he probably asked him whether or not it's okay to have it. And Tim, it was important for Tim that that for Day of the Tentacle, it's way more close to the original Like you saw that the remastered version, there was a verb bar that you couldn't have, right, when you play the game. Stuff like that. We did still want to have modern controls, but it was important for him to have the ability to play it with the high definition art, but as close to the original as possible. And it does help that Dave the Tentacle already, the art style, like Peter Chan's art style, is already cartoony here, and it really helps to make that work in high definition as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Now, still in 2016, you were credited under Programming Platform on Headlander. What was your role on that project?
Well, things are going fast. So we were still an independent company, and in order to stay afloat as an independent game studio, you just have to ship games nonstop. And Lee Petty, who was the project lead on Stacking, had in a previous internal game jam pitched this like retro sci-fi game called Headlander, which reimagines the world as kind of if the sci-fi from the 70s would have happened. As kind of a 2D-esque kind of Metrovania kind of game. And he started making that, and I just loved the visual style of this game so much. And I was very excited because I wanted to, and I love working with Lee too. He's a very strong sense of both technical and visual. So I was actually really excited about helping out on that project. And I did a lot of like the laser particle effects, have these little tiny swirling particles. I did all that stuff. That was a lot of fun to work on. But yeah, I was not initially supposed to be on Headlander, but I pushed our head of development hard to get some time on that project because I really wanted to be part of that game and work on that. Yeah, and I'm glad I did. It's a fun game.
Now, the following year, in 2017, you were credited as the lead programmer on Full Throttle Remastered.
That's right.
Now, Full Throttle has several action-heavy sequences, like the biker combat on the Old Mine Road and the Destruction Derby. And I remember talking to Dave Grossman. They had to bring him in as a freelancer to work on the Destruction Derby in the original version because the Scum engine couldn't handle this type of functionality in the game.
That's right.
So how challenging was it to remaster these segments compared to the traditional point-and-click gameplay that you remastered up to this point?
Yeah, so we had some experience. So the big innovation that Full Throttle had was that it combined the Scum engine with the Insane engine. Insane is the technology behind Rebel Assault, like it's Vince Lee's video playback system that he had set up for that. And these were, I think Eric Wilmon actually talked to you about it. These were like completely different game engines. And for Full Throttle, they just kind of, they took one sticky thing and another, and they're like, you know what? We just stick them next to each other. And when we want to do Scum-like game, point and click, we run over here. And when we do the other action stuff, we're going to use that over there. And so it was really tricky actually making these transitions, because when you go into any of these FMV scenes, like the road, going down the road or whatever, it switches to essentially a whole different game engine that relies entirely on FMV-based logic. And, Insane is really cool. I actually love it. It has a lot of interesting features where it has this stream of things that can happen, right? You have this endless scrolling roads, but then branching mechanic stuff can happen, and it has really, really cool stuff. But to get this to work in a remastered version was a real pain in the butt, because we had these high resolution versions that were video files, but then how do you actually make them work like in the original? Because the original Insane engine plays back parts of FMV, then pastes sprites on top of that to make part of the gameplay work. And it was really challenging to get all of that to work properly in the remastered version, where we essentially had like a video file playing back in an open source like video playback library, and then making this to sync up with the original exactly, right? And the gameplay frames was really challenging, because normally when you do video playback in games, it's like a fire and forget. You say, okay, video, you play, and it will run at whatever speed it runs. Like sometimes, the game loads something in the background, so there will be hitches, and sometimes the frame rate will just be slightly faster, slightly slower. Often it's so subtle that you wouldn't notice when you watch it. But when you want to synchronize gameplay precisely to something that another piece of technology says what it's supposed to be, it's really challenging. So Full Throttle was a lot of fun. We had a lot of experience by now. It was me and the our artists internally, but also Shiny Shoe again, who helped us with Grim Fandango, Day of the Tentacle, helped us with that. So they had a lot of experience, thankfully, and we could use a lot of our experience from the past to make that work. But yeah, this introduction of FMV gameplay was challenging. And I love the Dig. I see that you have a Dig as a background. It's a great game. I loved it when it came out. I know it had a very troubled development cycle. And in a way, I would love to also remaster that, but the idea of all the FMVs in there would just scare me. I don't know if I would ever really want to do it, because I worry there will be also pain there, but who knows?
Yeah, but the FMV scenes in the Dig are the
mostly
cutscenes.
separate. Yeah, mostly separate.
They're not,
yeah.
They added them because the game was in development for so long that the gameplay itself was outdated. Because 7 months before the Dig was released, Full Throttle came out, and it had those large character sprites. And the Dig had the character sprites that were back in the Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis days.
Yeah.
So that's why they added the insane cutscenes to make it more cinematic.
Yeah. But then if you imagine remastering that, right, if you in the Dig, you have these sequences where you go between the islands underwater through these along these rail tracks, right? And if you imagine you want to remaster that, you need to remodel everything. Probably the original 3D assets probably will never be found. And so there's a lot to make. It's all possible, but yeah, you're right. The gameplay is not quite as overlapping as it is with Full Throttle. But I'm somewhat scarred now after Full Throttle with FMV gameplay.
If you ever get access to the LucasArts archives, get the box that says the Dig, and we'll make it work. We'll find a way to remaster the Dig.
Yeah, that would be fun.
And one of the things that you mentioned in one of your talks is that in the archives, you don't just have the original assets and such, you also have images of computers of the developers themselves and the state they were in when they compiled the game or worked on the game.
That's right.
I know that usually people don't tidy up their computers on a regular basis. So how do you find what you need on a developer's computer from back in the 90s,
right,
when you're trying to remaster a classic like Full Throttle?
Well, first of all, it's amazing. I actually really think everybody should do it exactly like that, and don't take anything off and just take whatever image you have at the moment, because it's such a view, like a looking glass into that time, right? That point in time when that happened. Because when you look at the archives that for, I actually know exactly which one of the games it was, but we look through the machines that the people had that were archived, and you have the Doom shareware. Excuse me. You have the Doom shareware on there, or other things, stuff that was just popular games at the time. They're on these machines, and they were probably playing stuff in LAN, something like that. But yeah, how do you find it? This is the beginning of a project for remastering, where you're just essentially trying to find, you're trying to correlate, okay, what are the things we need? How many different versions of that thing we need can we find? When often you will find different versions, and which one is the one that is the real thing. Often what you do, you go, that, for a programmer, well, if you need source code, you will look there. And if you need something from animation stuff, then you could look at animator's computer, so you would need to correlate the name to what the role was. But then often the way you work with these remasters, right, it's you're starting out by extracting the assets that were used in the game from the binary pack file. And then what you get from the machines is often just auxiliary data. Okay, are there any original versions of the animations in their animation editor, for example, stuff like that. The Scrum scripts, that's always actually important. If you want to fix bugs in the gameplay script, finding the version of the script that's actually used in the binary pack file that the game was shipped with, that's not always trivial. Like you find slightly different versions of the scripts where clearly they were still in development and like people were adding gameplay features, or maybe they were never shipped. But then you need to try to figure out, is this really the version of the Scum script that we're running against? And then if so, and that's important when you want to fix bugs, right? You run into some kind of problem and the game doesn't work the way you want, and you want to look at the original gameplay script, but then you have 4 different versions. Like, which one of these am I actually looking at to try to understand where the bug comes from? And that can be really challenging. And yeah, so it's tricky sometimes to correlate. But often, in the beginning of the project, that's what you do. You find these kind of master lists of files that are relevant, and so you have a database essentially of like, okay, here are the Scum scripts that we're pretty confident are the ones that were used. Yeah.
Getting back to the action scenes in Full Throttle, were there any discussions about adjusting the difficulty of these action sequences, especially given the fact of how they were received in the original version? Or was the goal to keep them as close to the original experience as possible?
From what I remember, Tim was pretty much against making changes there. He was like, no, this is the game that I made, and this is the game we're gonna ship. So I don't remember being part of any serious discussions about making changes there. But yeah, I mean, it is very Tim. If you play Full Throttle, you can definitely see the path to Brutal Legend, right? He's trying to break out of this traditional Scum, and he's played all kind of other games, and he wants to do other things. He wants to do more actiony things. Now, having worked with him, this makes a lot of sense that this would happen. But Scum just wasn't made for that. So the derby scene, yeah, it's a perfect example of that, where it's a simple idea, and maybe if you had a more general purpose game engine, that would have not been a big deal. But the way Scum was architected, it just was never meant to be used for this kind of scrolling environment with multiple things moving around, and you can bump into each other and whatnot. Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to ask about the remaster itself is that in the end, there's a scene in which one of the final puzzles in the game is that Ben is in the plane and he needs to realize that his bike is on the left. And in the original game, which was a 4x3, which had a 4x3 resolution, you needed to walk left, and then you'd have some horizontal scrolling, and then you'll see the bike.
You see him,
but in the widescreen version, it's just there.
Yep. Yeah, that's the unfortunate part. I mean, we knew that this is the kind of stuff that you can run into. There's other times where we ran into this similar issues, like the beginning of Day of the Tentacle, where you have the cutscene panning across the house, right, where the tentacles are at the back of the poisoned river. That was also authored for a 4x3. This intro cutscene was authored for a 4x3 aspect ratio. And sometimes you can fix it, but with a situation like that, there's very difficult to fix. And I don't even know if we talked about maybe moving it and then somehow hacking the gameplay script to make this work. I don't know. I don't recall that.
I think you guys hacked it. You moved the birds, which paused mid-air, and you move them a bit to the right so that in the 4x3, you don't see them until they enter the scene. And in the widescreen, they just start moving when the intro starts.
Right. Yeah, for the Tentacle, right, that's what we did there. But the thing you were mentioning about Full Throttle with the bike, I don't remember having any specific discussions about it, but it's possible that I expect that the Shiny Shoe folks would have talked to Tim about it, whether we should do something about it. But like I said, as opposed to, so when we were working on Monkey Island Special Edition, right, at LucasArts, none of the original creators were there anymore. So these special editions were made by fans, and we did what we thought would be right, and sometimes there would be some controversy around it, right? Guybrush's hair is the obvious example where people were very up in arms about it. But then with the remasters, since we had Tim there he could definitely drive this remastering process. And some things were very important to him. And I think if we would have had Ron or Tim or Dave to be available doing the special editions to drive that process, the special editions would have been very different, is my guess. But yeah, we'll never know. We'll never know. I don't think Ron likes the special editions anyway. But yeah.
Then again, Ron doesn't like the animated style of Day of the Tentacle either. So
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
And during your trip to the LucasArts archives, did you have access to the original design documents for any of the remastered games? And if you did you use them for anything during the remastering process?
So the thing is, I forget why, but when they went up to Skywalker Ranch to look at the archive, I wasn't there. I think I was on vacation during that time, which is a big shame. I'm bummed out by this still to this day, because I would have loved to go. First of all, the ranch is a beautiful place to be, but then to be able to go into archive would have been magical. But anyway, yes, I remember they brought back scans of stuff because we did the concept art gallery, right? So we had definitely found some of the original concept art drawings, and also I'm pretty sure the game design documents too. And they were trying to figure out what are we going to add as additional features for the fans, and ended up being this concept art gallery. But initially we were like, well, should we have other stuff in there, like the design doc or whatnot? And I remember, I think Matt Hansen, who was the head of production at this time, I'm pretty sure he had like pages of the Full Throttle or Day of the Tentacle design doc like posted on his office while we were working on that, because he found them hilarious. Yeah, but we didn't use it for anything productively. Like we had Tim there. If we wanted to know anything, we would just talk to Tim.
Now, it contributed to the remaster of both Monkey Islands, Grim Fandango, Day of the Tentacle, and Full Throttle. Across these projects, which game posed the biggest challenge in terms of remastering?
Which one is the best? I think Full Throttle, probably because of the FMV aspects. It was real challenging. Yeah, I think I stick with that answer. No, it was real hard work to make all that stuff work. And for a while, we were not sure if we have to implement our own video playback system to make the syncing up work. Yeah, Full Throttle definitely. The other ones, I mean, Day of the Tentacle is so close. It's just a Scum game, right? Mostly, and there were some other things like some of the swirling things, like they had some full screen effects that were brand new back then in Scum that they didn't support previously, but we could support that pretty easily. Grim was weird because we didn't find any of the original art source assets, so we were initially hoping that we could re-render the original backgrounds at a higher resolution, but we never found them anywhere in any of the archives. So the challenge with Grim was how do we have the high resolution characters to still mesh very well with the background, but that ended up actually not being a big deal because the original backgrounds had a lot of detail in it, so having more detail on the characters actually works pretty well. But then, yeah, Full Throttle was just much more challenging because of the FMV aspect. And sometimes you have weird things where sometimes you think like, oh, clearly this is probably like some kind of little FMV sprite, but then it's actually like a traditionally animated Scum sequence where just the sprites are really big. So normally, clearly, you can see that some of the people working on Full Throttle had previously done Scum games, and some of them had worked with Insane. So it was interesting seeing how these different people approached implementation of different features in the game with the different tech that ended up being in there.
So if you hadn't implemented the switching between the classic version and the remastered version feature back in the Monkey Island days, then it would have been easier for you to work on Full Throttle, because then you wouldn't have to worry about switching back and forth, and then the FMV scenes wouldn't be that
probably
horrible to work on.
That's right. Yeah. If you abandon the original version, if you say we're not going to show it, then you can make all kind of changes and hacks, and people probably mostly wouldn't know. But once you say that it's the original game and you can switch back at any time, you're adding some constraints that you have to live with, and sometimes they're tricky constraints.
So you got only yourself to blame.
That's right. Yeah. It's okay. It was all. The thing is, even though I have to say that's more difficult, all these projects were a lot of fun, and I enjoyed working on all of those. Yeah, I worked on all. I worked on all the Tim Tim adventure game remasters. And so I ran out of Tim games, which is, so what to do now? I have to go branch out and do some other LucasArts adventure games.
You actually worked on all the LucasArts remasters, right?
Yeah.
All of them.
Yep.
Now, when it came to the Scum engine, when Humongous Entertainment started using the Scum engine, they had to sign an agreement with LucasArts because they used the code that was produced at LucasArts. Now, since you used extensive parts from the code you've written back in the Monkey Island Special Edition days in the Scum remasters, did you have to sign an agreement with LucasArts apart from the using their IP of using their proprietary code?
I'm a programmer. I don't really have to do with the legal aspect as possible. I'm sure there was all kind of some legal agreement had to be reached. I don't know exactly what the scope is there, but I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
I mean, did you have to use the code that you did back in the Monkey Island Special Edition, or was it something that you could just reproduce from scratch?
I don't think that was stipulated. Really, this only applied to Day of the Tentacle, right? Remastered. So here's the thing: they actually had started. LucasArts Singapore had started Day of the Tentacle Remaster. It was just never released. So what we got was the prototype version of that Day of the Tentacle Remaster, which really had just the beginning of the game in it. And they had taken some liberties with the art style that Tim was not fond of. So he saw that version and he was like, no, we're not doing that. We're going back to what it was like. But I don't think we would have needed to use it. But given that we were an independent game studio and had very limited resources making these projects happening, it was never on the table to use some other technology base to make this work.
Do you have screenshots from that Day of the Tentacle version from LucasArts Singapore?
I do not, and probably am not even allowed to show any of that stuff, but yeah.
I'll have to talk to Tim.
Yes, please.
Now, in 2019, you received a thank you credit on Pathway. How did you contribute to this game?
I helped a little bit as well. Consulting is too far reaching. I know the developers here in Germany. And so we met at the GDC Europe one year and we were chatting and we kind of stayed in contact. And they were working on the Switch stuff. And since I had done the Grim Fandango Switch port, I had a lot of experience getting stuff on Switch at this point. And the programmer on that project had some questions about the workflow, how to just even get the whole like Switch development process going in the first place. Sometimes when you work with on consoles specifically, you have to specialize hardware, the development kit. That's depending on the era and the company can be very constricted. Like, for example, for PlayStation 4 development, you needed to every month download like a license key from Sony just to be able to use a dev kit. And so with every dev kit, there's some kind of thing because these console companies don't want this hardware to be available really to people out there, right? Hackers or who knows what. So there's usually some hurdles to get any development going on that. So I just, since I knew how to get it started, I helped out a little bit, answering some questions. But really just very little. There's a very awesome programmer there. And I just, after the initial, like getting that thing actually going, he ran with it and shipped that game. But yeah, they're very nice guys.
Awesome. And in 2021, you were credited as the lead systems programmer for Psychonauts 2. Now, I watched the Psychodyssey documentary 4 times, and I expected you to be a lot more present in that documentary. Where'd you hide when they produced that documentary?
Excuse me. I was hiding in Germany. Yeah, I had at this point. So up until 2015, so the end of Broken Age, I was living in San Francisco and working on site in the studio. But then my wife and I moved back to Germany in 2015. So all of the other remasters and Headlander and all that stuff I've done remotely from here. And Psychonauts 2 was the same thing. So I worked remotely, and that's tricky to do if you're part of documentary to be part of that. Like especially the beginning before Corona, 2-player production would work just like in Broken Age, where they would go around with a camera and film the development process. And if you're not in the office, then they can't just shoot like candid shots of you programming because you're just not there. And the story of Psychonauts 2, the struggle behind that is also just a very different one. And I'm glad they showed that because it was a challenging project, and I think it's good to show that it is actually a lot of work and sometimes surprising things that can be difficult, that they documented that. But yeah, it was not a lot in there just because the system aspect didn't really take spotlight in there. Key was a lot in the documentary, and that's great because he's the lead programmer and he has a lot to say and he's great. So that's why, it makes sense you see him a lot more. But my aspects were really just like, okay, how are we gonna get that thing going on all the consoles and running on target performance? And that's just not so super interesting as a story. Unlike in Broken Age, where I brought up the whole engine and a lot of the tools and all that stuff, there was a lot more dramatic things happening. Versus here, we were using Unreal now, and my work was mostly like trying to figure out why things don't run as fast as they do. And since I'm not in the office, then it's really difficult to capture that. But yeah.
Okay, too bad.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what you've been working on since?
I cannot yet talk about it. It's awesome though. It will be fun. That will be something very different. But yeah, hopefully more information about that soonish.
Is it the same thing that Melina was talking about when I talked to her a year and a half ago? She was talking about something very cool that's going to come out in the future. Is this the same cool thing?
It may be. I mean, Melina is awesome, and she was doing driving a lot of the narrative tools for all the projects. And we have several projects that are happening. I don't know which one specifically which she was thinking about, but I'm sure it was ours because our project is awesome and very cool. So I'm sure that was it.
Now, before we conclude our conversation, one final question for me. What are your plans for 2025, and how can people stay in touch with you and your work?
Ooh, my plans. Well, I hope that we're gonna get closer to getting this game out of the door because, it was interesting now talking to you because if you go through my credits, right, you notice that in the beginning of the Double Fine years, it's like, okay, well, there's 2010 you shipped the game, and 2012, and then 2015, and 2016, 2017, 18, 19, and then 21, and then a huge gap. And that's, we're just making very different games, and we're not an independent game studio anymore. We're part of Microsoft now, which means that we don't have this this constant thread that's hanging over our head of running out of money and closing the studio down. But it does appear that we're using that to make these projects longer, and we're not releasing documentary, doing projects that usually happens afterwards, stuff like that. So my plan is to just, we've been working on a game that I work on for a while. I would like to see it closer to being done. And how can people stay in touch with me? I mean, I'm on Blue Sky. I'm not so active on that other platform anymore. Don't want to talk about it. But yeah, Blue Sky, people can send me an email to my work email if they want. I try to answer when I can, but I might take me some days to reply. sometimes I get emails with questions about stuff and advice. People ask for advice, and I try to do that. The other day, I got an email, somebody asking us if we could send in the source code for the Once Upon a Monster Furtek. And that, of course, I cannot do, but I admire the brazenness of sending an
the
email.
audacity.
Yeah. That's good. It's good. Chutzpah, right? That's what you would say?
Yeah, exactly.
This is the exact definition of chutzpah. I admire, and I responded. I said, "Yeah, thanks for your interest, but unfortunately, I can't give you that code."
What did he expect? That you just send him, okay, here it is, and a Dropbox link?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, in the past, while we were still not part of Microsoft, we were talking more about what can we make open source of the stuff that we write. Like for a while, we were talking about, can we take the Broken Age engine and just make it open source? And ultimately, it didn't happen, mostly because the problem is we were always, everything had to go so fast so that we can even stay operational, that we just can't sit down and clean up that code base in a way that it can be made open source and removing things that are problematic that couldn't be in a public domain. But it is something that we wanted to do more originally. So I guess from that perspective, it makes sense to us. But yeah, if you're asking, if anybody wants to send me an email and ask about code, that probably will not be possible.
Well, Oliver, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. And if they ever decide to remaster Loom or The Dig, I truly hope they bring you back as the lead developer.
I would love to do more of the LucasArts adventure games. That would be fun. Yeah, it was fun talking to you. It's kind of nice in a way to reflect on all the things and some of the stuff I haven't thought about in a long time. It's nice. And yeah, thank you for doing all these conversations and for recording all of that history, really, for other people to learn about.
And I usually thank the people I interview for making the games that made my childhood great. But for you, in your case, I want to thank you for the games that made my adulthood great, because I played them as an adult. So thank you, Oliver.
You're quite welcome. It's a fun job I found myself in, and I still love it every day. I wouldn't want to do anything else. So it's good.